Thank you very much for coming to this conference, and I hope that you will find it edifying and informative. First, announcements. The Center's summer visiting faculty member, each summer we invite a distinguished faculty member. We've had Shirley Bright Heath, Marcelo Suarez Orozco, many distinguished scholars over the years. And this summer we'll have Tyrone Howard, one of my former students. That's the first in this series to have a former student do this. But Tyrone Howard, as you know, at UCLA is quite a distinguished scholar himself now, and he'll be teaching our summer course. The flyer's in your folder, and it'll move from July. His course will run from July 21st to August 1st, so spread the good news. But Tyrone will be coming back to UW. I'd like to start out with acknowledgement. It takes a village to organize a successful conference. No one can do it alone. I would like to thank the organizations and individuals who made this conference possible. First, I would like to thank our co-sponsors, which are listed at the bottom of your program, who provided financial support. It takes a lot of money to put on a conference. To rent this room, for example, you'd be astonished what it costs, even though we are a public university. It takes a lot of money. And let me thank publicly those organizations on campus that put up the money for this conference, that helped us with it. And of course our center put up money also. The UW College of Education put up money, last money. This conference is internally funded. So many of our outreach activities are funded up from outside funds, but this is internally funded. The second time we've done this. I just wrote a big grant for Spencer to sponsor our next conference, hopefully in Bellagio, Italy. But this notion of sponsoring inside, but you can't keep going back. So I've done it twice now, and now hopefully Spencer and Rockefeller will sponsor the next one. Hopefully it'll be in Bellagio, Italy, but we'll know that in a few months. So the sponsors are, again, were the UW College of Education, the Office of Minority Affairs and Diversity at UW, the Diversity Research Institute at UW, and the Education Program at UW-Bothell. Let's thank them all for helping us. People who have helped individuals, Tai Wang and Yiting Chu, research assistant in the center, are absolutely magical. Could they stand? I think Kyle, could you stand and be acknowledged? And I think Yiting is working the front desk. They are the best thing that ever. One of the best things that ever happened to the center was my hiring of them. Then I'd like to thank the volunteers who are helping this morning. Kent Jewell, an administrative assistant in the College of Ed, is Kent. I think again he's outside working. Also, three of my graduates are graduate students in multicultural education. Tavis Linson, a doctoral student, is Tavis. I think he's out front. No, there he is. Thank you. Sunun Park, I think she's out front, and Natalie White, one of our PhD students, Natalie, and she's going to be our photographer. We're going to start with welcoming comments from two of our distinguished administrators on campus, and we're going to start with Dr. Sheila Edwards-Lang, one of our co-sponsors, but also Vice President for Minority Affairs and Vice Provost, and also a distinguished alumni of our College of Education, Dr. Sheila Edwards-Lang.
Thank you, Jim. I'm happy to be here this morning. So on behalf of the University of Washington, Seattle, I have to say that because my colleagues from Bothell are here, I'm delighted to welcome you to campus today and to this conference on youth civic education and the launch of the new book topic on this topic. I want to thank and acknowledge Dr. Banks for continuing to keep civic education and its importance in a diverse democracy on our agenda, both here on campus, in our state, in our country, and indeed around the world. So thank you, Jim, for your work on this topic. We need look no further than recent headlines to find evidence of why this work is so critical to the survival of our democracy as we know it. We see growing inequality, too often along racial and gender lines, political parties with polarizing ideologies and little tolerance for diverse perspectives or approaches to solving problems, stalled progress on immigration reform, often due to heightened concern about who is or should be a U.S. citizen. And unfortunately, the reemergence of gang violence in our urban centers and a new wave of it in rural communities. Aristotle claimed that the citizens of a state should always be educated to suit the constitution of the state. If we were to grade ourselves as educators on how we've done in this civic education and working for the greater good, it's unfortunate, but we would get failing marks. Many of our children, and for that matter, adults, have not learned yet what the greater good is and their role and responsibility as citizens to strive for it. According to Horace Mann, the great moral attribute of self-government cannot be born or matured in a day. And if children are not trained to it, we only prepare ourselves for disappointment if we expect it from grown men. Civic life today is increasingly a disappointment, but that is because we have not adequately educated our children to participate fully in it. That is why this report is so important, and the work that will follow from it is so important. It is a clarion call to all of us as educators to do better, to do more, or risk seeing further declines in civic life and our democracy. I want to thank you for being here today. Your being here today is actually a political act, whether you know it or not. And this work is a political act. It is important to the strength of our democracy. It's important to our global connectedness to the world. And I want to thank you for your work and thank you for being here today. Enjoy.
And I want to thank Dr. Sheila Edwards-Lang whenever I come knocking. She was actually the first person to say, I'm ready to help. And I'll always be deeply grateful for her support. And it's been very edifying over the years. I'd like to next bring forth Dr. Susan Jeffords, Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs from UW-Bothell, also one of our co-sponsors. Dr. Jeffords.
Thank you, Jim. It's really an honor to be here to speak on this important topic and listen to and learn from all of you. And also, by the way, I'm available for opening remarks at the Bellagio conference, just in case that spot's open. Reading through the report, which I found so impressive, reminded me of something that one of my students told me that I think was very edifying for me. A UW student participated in a study abroad class a number of years ago, where she had the opportunity to join students. There were 10 UW students, 10 students from the American University in Cairo and 10 students from the American University in Beirut. And the class was on citizenship and national identity, and they met in Cyprus. And when she came back, she was, as so often happens with students who study abroad, she was transformed. But I said, what's the most important thing that you learned? And she said, I learned that I'm an American. And I said, what are you talking about? That seems self-evident. And she said, the first day of the class, they sat around as a group and introduced themselves. The American student said, well, I'm from Philadelphia. I'm from Atlanta. I'm from Seattle. I like basketball. I'm studying sociology. I'm studying physics. My family has 6 people. My parents are, from another country. And every one of them talked about themselves and their personal and social identities. Every one of the students from the other universities began by saying, I'm Lebanese, I'm Syrian, I'm Palestinian, I'm Egyptian. And at the end of the introductions, those students said to all the Americans, don't you think of yourselves as Americans? Not one of you said, I'm an American in your introduction. And the American students were dumbfounded. And it became the opening of a revelation for all of them about how they thought of themselves and who they were. And to me, the subject of this discussion today speaks very much to that notion of what it means to be an American, and the fact that very many of our young people would not answer that question, I'm an American, first, when somebody says, who are you? And so I really feel very passionately about the subject of this discussion, especially because the work that the panelists have done, the work that this report is doing, is really promoting the concept of American citizenship in a nonpartisan way, in a way that brings everyone together across divides and indeed encourages young people to learn how to bridge those divides. And I can't imagine at this moment in time a more important subject matter. And so it's really an honor for me personally to be here, but also to represent the Bothell campus and the education program there, which I believe actually exemplifies a lot of the work that is outlined in this report. So I'm looking forward to all of this. I welcome all of you, and with Sheila, acknowledge and thank that you've made the commitment to be part of this conversation today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Susan. I first became of her work. She doesn't know this when she gave a brilliant lecture in Kane Hall, this very building. I believe it dealt with gender issues. I also want to acknowledge Professor Luis Fraga, who's also one of our co-sponsors, from the director of the Diversity Research Institute, and you'll hear from him in our second plenary session. Thank you, Luis. And is it public yet? No. Okay. It is. Apparently we'll be losing him to Notre Dame, and I'm heartbroken. I just heard the word. Let me move on to our key presentations. We're starting out with Professor William Damon from Stanford. Professor Damon first initiated the project that led to this publication. He initiated it within the National Academy of Education, of which we are both members, and he put together a panel there in which he invited me to co-participate and co-direct. And working with him on this project for the last 3 years has been an intellectually enriching experience and a joyous one. He really walks the talk. He writes about morality and values, and he kind of lives that. Being with Bill is just such a pleasure to work with a man with such high integrity and professionalism. Professor William Damon is Professor of Education and Director of the Center on Adolescence at Stanford University. He is one of the world's leading scholars of human development. I knew he was impressive, but when I was preparing this introduction, I read his Wikipedia entry, and boy, did I learn a lot more about him. I'd known him for 5 years, but that's an impressive entry. I told him I want a Wikipedia entry as nice as his. Mine is much shorter. He has written. I got to get one of my graduate students to go in and beef it up after reading Bill's. Bill has written extensively on character development at all ages of life. His books include The Path to Purpose, How Young People Find Their Calling in Life, Noble Purpose, The Joy of Living a Meaningful Life, and Moral Child, Nurturing Children's Natural Moral Growth. He is the editor-in-chief of the impressive Handbook of Child Psychology. At present, he is working on projects aimed at promoting purpose, character, good work, and participatory citizenship. Professor Damon is a member, and this is where I met him, of the National Academy of Education, and was recently elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, which every academic dies to get into. And it's mysterious. Somebody knocks on your door one day and says, you are a member. So I am very pleased to welcome Professor Damon to the Center for Multicultural Education and to the University of Washington. Professor Damon.
Thank you so much, Jim, for that lovely introduction. I've come to expect over-the-top everything from Jim, who he says it may take a village to organize a conference, but the village has to have a guru at the center of it that gets everybody going. And the genius guru of all time is Jim Banks, and I've learned so much from working with him and appreciate it so much. Every minute of it is a joy and a pleasure. And actually, Jim gave me credit for generating this idea of our Stanford conference, but he may not even remember that before we had our Washington conference at the National Academy, he and I had breakfast. You probably don't even remember this, Jim, at AERA, where we're both fellows, and a couple of years before that, and that's where the idea was actually cooked up. So he is not taking credit that he very much deserves for all of this. And the other thing, and now I'll speak about the field of civic education and youth civic development. I got interested in this what seems like a long time ago, back in the 1990s, the late 1990s. And at that time, there was a lot of talk and a lot of data about what was then called disengagement. The idea that young people in our country were not throwing themselves into all kinds of spheres of life the way, at least there was a sense that previous generations had, that there was something motivational that was going on that was a problem. And this was showing up in a particularly disturbing way in the civic arena, where at that time the main index was voting behavior, and voting behavior had gone down in an absolutely linear trend since 1972 among the 18 to 24 year age group. 1972 was the year that 18-year-olds were given the right to vote in this country, and about 70 or 80% of 18-year-olds, people in the 18 to 24-year-old group took that opportunity in 1972, and in an absolutely stepwise fashion until the year 2008. There was a decline until I think 2004 it was at 48%. There was a little blip up in 2008 to 52% when Obama ran against John McCain, but that number has settled back down again. And disengagement, of course, is a problem, and especially for people in a democracy where you really want citizens to participate, and especially young people to participate, because that predicts the direction of their later lives. So I got interested in this, and at the time, the people who had been working in this field were a small handful, and Jim Banks was front and center at that. In fact, it's Jim and I think Connie Flanagan was the other person that were really the pioneers in this whole field of civic education and civic development. Now, I started doing some research at Stanford on this in the early part of the 2000s up until now, and there were a couple of things that I learned that at least modified and further defined this idea of disengagement. Disengagement is going on. It's a fact. It's something that, and Sheila mentioned the idea of a hesitancy to think of yourself as an American or an American citizen, and a lot of the interviews we do with young people, it's exactly what we find. They say things like, American citizenship, well, yeah, I heard about that in school last year, but I kind of forget what it is. I mean, things like things that make you kind of really wonder what the most basic understanding of what the heart of being a participatory citizen is like, and how little it means to young people. But in the research that we've done, we find a more complex picture, and we actually find a lot of engagement in something that you could call civic activities among every group of young people. You see a lot of community involvement. You see even some political activities around very particular issues that arise from time to time in a community. And these could include something like in some minority communities, activities of police that are a problem for the young people. They feel oppressed. They feel, or somebody even worse, one of their friends has been arrested or shot even. And then you start seeing activity. You see groups of kids getting together. You see protests. You see even emails being written. You see a lot of use of social network around these activities. And in other communities, communities that may be less troubled, you see a lot of volunteer activities, a lot of service. That's one of the, I think, one of the silver linings of youth development in the last couple of decades is there's been a huge increase in volunteerism and community service. So it's not the case that there's disengagement in every sense of the word, but what there is a lack of is a connection to an understanding of how our democracy works, the kind of thing that supposedly is taught in civics or history. And civics and history among our students today is the absolutely lowest subject in terms of being tested. You read in the newspapers the great concern about math, for example, that we're behind Koreans and Finns and most of the industrial world in our math knowledge among high school students. But even lower than test scores on math are test scores in history and civics. And so there's very little connection between all of the activities that you see among young people and interest in their community, in civics in the broad sense, and the nuts and bolts of governance, which is what is supposed to be taught in schools. So we brought together in the meeting that produced this report a group of 7 people who really have been dedicating their lives to promoting and understanding civic development, and we very consciously tried to get a bipartisan group or across at least across a reasonable range of ideological points of view. We did, extremes are always, to me, less interesting, actually, or certainly less constructive. But within a reasonably broad, relatively left to right, center left to center right, we collected a group of people and came up with, I think, some really innovative and not strictly conventional wisdom ideas about what could be done to bring young people into the fold of democratic citizenship as is necessary for the future of this society. And I'll just mention a couple of the things that I learned from the conference that I hadn't. There were a lot of things, even though I've been studying this for a couple of decades now, there were a lot of insights that were, to me, enlightening and revealing. And one of them I'll eagerly give credit to Eric Liu for making us aware of, which is the idea that what is at the heart of civic education, in the sense of governance, is the idea of power, of understanding that in a democracy, what a democracy is all about is opening opportunities for power, at least in the sense of self-determination and control over your destiny, opening opportunities for power for everybody. That's what a democracy is all about. But in order to achieve that, in order to gain control of your destiny, to gain your rightful shot at having some political power, you have to know how the system works. You have to know how to enter it. You have to know how to do all the things ranging from campaigning, from promoting things, from maybe stepping up yourself to positions of civic leadership, whether that means a local office or serving on a committee or running for president. And you have to know how this is done and how how to line up with other people, to form lobby groups or allegiances or take part in a party. And you even have to know a little bit about the tradition, about examples of how people have done it before. And all of this means that schools, where is this going to happen? It means schools need to step up to the plate and do something that makes it apparent to young people how this is in their interest to learn the stuff that the schools are trying to teach in this area. And that's, of course, exactly not what's being done. To the extent that civics is being taught, and that to that extent has shrunken as we've become increasingly interested in the basic skills that allow you to become employable, like literacy or numeracy. To the extent that it's done at all, though, it's done in a way that is dry, is a bunch of cookbook rules that don't even connect necessarily with the kind of thing that I myself, as a young person, would want to pursue as a goal in my life. So how do you do this? How do you find a way to create an engaging subject matter that is civics? And again, people among our group came up with some pretty compelling ideas. And one is, do not do what is being done everywhere right now, which is avoid the controversies. Don't just try to teach the pablum of the list of the Bill of Rights or teach the Constitution as a kind of a thing to memorize, but actually teach why do people argue? Why do people fight about, for example, the two great elements of our American democracy, which are liberty and equality. These are the great ideals that got our founders moving. That's the reason we fought against the British and liberated ourselves, is that we believe, and ought to believe, that there are equal rights under the law, and every citizen should have those, whether high-born or low-born in an economic sense. And we ought to do something to promote that. And, in addition, we need to promote the idea that every individual has the dignity of having the ability to follow their own conscience. That's liberty. To pursue life, liberty, and happiness in the way that they see fit under the law. And these two ideals don't always sit easily together. This is why a lot of our political fights happen, because some people really believe in liberty and don't want to be told that you need to do this or pay this kind of taxes or do this and this to make sure that everybody has at least a relative amount of equality. And there are people on the other side of things that say, no, you need to regulate and do things and control the extent of liberty. It's a legitimate debate. It's always going to be in tension. And the genius of our democracy has been that this tension has been constructive. And it has usually come down in a progressive liberation of groups of people who have been oppressed in the past. And that's something to be proud of. There's a lot to be proud of in the American democratic tradition, and that is one of the bases for the sense that giving young people the sense that I am an American and I want to be an American citizen and I want to assume the tradition and further it, the tradition that I've inherited from the people all the way back to the creators of the Constitution. So the idea of teaching the controversies, teaching the tensions, understanding why people fight and why you would want to participate and take your own position in that fight. That's exciting for young people, and that can motivate them. And so a lot of what this is about is exactly about motivation. To use the phrase that, the term that we rely on a lot in our work, in our lab at Stanford, it's about purpose. It's about giving young people a sense of civic purpose, where they really care. They care about the society, they care about the democracy, and when you care enough, you're actually willing to sacrifice. You're willing to live a life of what used to be called civic virtue, where you accept that you have an obligation. And this is the final thing I'll say, and it's another part of the report, is that citizenship comes with lots of rights, and young people, of course, need to be taught to to pursue those rights aggressively. That's part of gaining political power. But it also comes with obligations. And this is another area that a lot of educators have been hesitant to embrace because they're afraid that they'll lose young people. They'll lose the students, and they'll scare them away. Oh my God, I have a duty to do something. But I can tell you as a developmental psychologist that studied this stuff for decades now that exactly the opposite is the case. When you give a young person a sense that I have a responsibility for something, I can do something to contribute, I can make a difference, I can meet this challenge, I'll give it my all, that's exactly what gets young people motivated. That's what gets them off the dime. They love the idea of contributing, of being important, of mattering in the world, of making a difference. And so the idea that educators would give young people a sense that, you know what, you have inherited a lot of rights. You are very lucky to be here in this country as a citizen, and you owe something to the society. You owe the society your allegiance. You owe them your efforts. You owe them your vote. You need to vote. You need to serve on juries. You need to come to the forefront if there's an emergency, if there's a national crisis. You need to step up to the plate. This is the opposite of losing young people. It's exactly what's needed to get them to feel confident, to feel proud. People talk about self-esteem. This is what gives young people self-esteem. So the report is full of great insights like this. I learned a lot from it. I can say that I'm delighted to say that it's being used in lots of places, including my home state of California. California has now created a task force on citizenship education. Jerry Brown himself has waved this around. I kid you not. The task force met in June. There's a whole effort to make citizenship a part of the Common Core the way California is doing it, and to make it a lively field of education that's highly motivating, in a new way. And so I thank Eric and Jim and the other members of the panel that aren't here for their contributions to this. I think this is only the beginning. This is one step forward. This conference is another step forward. I think it's a great event. Thank you, Jim, very much for organizing it, and thank you everybody for being here.
I'd like to thank Bill for his wisdom and always his graciousness. Our next speaker, I'll just explain the procedure. Our next speaker will be Eric Liu, and after Eric speaks, then you'll have time before the break to interact with them, and that's why we have the mic there. Eric Liu is an author, educator, and civic entrepreneur. He's founder of Citizen University, which promotes and teaches the art of great citizenship through a portfolio of national programs. He teaches civic leadership at the University of Washington, I think in the School of Law. Is that correct? And serves on numerous nonprofit and civic boards. His books include The Accidental Asian, Notes of a Native Speaker, and Guiding Lights, How to Mentor and Find Life's Purpose. He is the co-author of The Gardens of Democracy and The True Patriot. Eric is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School, so he went to both of the good places. He served as a speechwriter for President Bill Clinton and later as the President's Deputy Domestic Policy Advisor. He frequently writes editorials for Time magazines, which I always find insightful and perceptive. One of Eric's most powerful and insightful Time editorials is called Trayvon Martin and Making Whiteness Visible. And if you haven't read that one, you can download it on the internet. It's very powerful. I think I sent Eric a note when that came out in Time. I'm very pleased to welcome Eric to the Center for Multicultural Education and to the College of Education. Eric.
Jim, thank you so very much for not just that introduction, but for gathering us here today. Bill, thank you for your remarks as well. It really was a joy, a delight to spend a good chunk of time with both of you and some of our colleagues, helping to cook up ideas and debate ideas that ultimately took this form. And I hope those of you who haven't had a chance yet to take a look at this report, at this document, really do. And do in earnest, not just because Jerry Brown's waving it around, which is nice to learn, but because, in a sense, I think as powerful and important as both Jim and Bill have made clear this topic is, in a sense, they both understate just how, I think, provocative some of the ideas are in this report, and how much it is intended to shake us loose from habits, often unwitting habits of thinking or not thinking about what it means to be an American, what it means to educate for Americanness. They really did a fantastic job in pulling this report together, but I think also in sustaining this conversation and debate and discussion through gatherings like this. I'm really thrilled to be here. I do teach in a couple different parts of the University of Washington, and so I often will park downstairs here, but I hardly ever get to hang out in this room, so this is just a delight to be in the Walker Ames room. And I was reflecting just as we were sitting here, I've actually just by chance had sort of a Pac-12 24 hours here, because yesterday afternoon I was down in Eugene speaking at the University of Oregon at their School of Journalism and Communication about the topic of media and the meaning of citizenship. And to here now spend this morning with my friends and colleagues from Stanford and the University of Washington, I think our coast is representing well in the country in reckoning with these topics. And I think that's actually not just a mere matter of happenstance. I do think that there is a sense in which the farther you get from Washington, the other Washington, the farther you get from the traditional hierarchies and structures of power and the traditional kind of encrusted notions of how power is allocated in this country, the more open-minded you can become, the more imaginative you can become about purpose, about possibility, about the meaning of our national identity. And it's certainly on our coast that demographically we see the future today. And so we are grappling before they are in D.C. and other parts of the country with the work of stitching together a multicultural tapestry and creating, unum out of the pluribus. And I think that, so it's not just mere Pac-12 pride, but I think something about being on this part of America that makes us the new America, and very exciting. One of the things that you heard Bill Damon talk a fair amount about in describing the content of this document is this combination of power, naming power, and on the one hand, on the other hand, character. What Bill described as virtue. And when we first gathered at Stanford, I don't remember when that was, a year and a half or 2 years ago now, we had conversations about this twinning of power and character, literacy and power, but also a grounding in character education, in being unabashed about facing either of those topics. Both of them, in their own way, provoke a bit of anxiety or a fear that they're going to step on somebody's toes or stir up controversy or create, defensiveness and a feeling of judgmentalness. But if we want to take seriously the idea of educating for citizenship, we have to, in a sense, get over it. We have to be willing to name power, and we have to be willing to assert that there is such a thing as virtue, there is such a thing as pro-social civic character, that liberty taken to an extreme can be called by another name, which is being a sociopath, and that it does fall to those of us who want to form a rising generation to have an opinion about how any command of power must be coupled with character. And so that theme runs throughout this report, and I'm really glad that Bill got to really underscore that for you, because I think that will be a big part of the takeaway for this document and for our conversation today. It's actually a pivot to what I wanted to talk about this morning, because I wanted to really spend some time on a different aspect, both of this report and of the work that we've had the chance to do together. And that is really exploring the question that both Sheila and Susan, in their own ways, raised in their introductory comments, which is this: who is us? Who is us? Right? Who is us is probably the most American question there is. It is certainly the oldest American question. And yet it is one that, even as we reckon with its implications and consequences every single day, in our workplaces, in our family lives, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in the media we consume, it's not actually something that we often explicitly talk about. And I think this is a moment, not just this convening today, but this time in our country's history, where getting more people like us to show up and get ready to talk explicitly about who is us is a national imperative. What I wanted to talk about this morning, really, just to structure my remarks, is in the first place, this moment that we are in this country. Secondly, what it is that I think, even as there are many centrifugal forces pulling us apart, what it is that can unite us. And then third, what our task as educators or educators of educators is in reckoning with all of this. So let me start first with just this moment. This moment we are living through, and we all feel it and know it on some level, and those of us who've been paying attention to news and political news in particular over the last couple of years are especially attuned to it. But let me just state it plainly. Congratulations, we are living through historic times. We are living through a period of nearly unprecedented inequality and concentration of wealth, income, and opportunity in this country. Not seen since at least before the Great Depression, the turn of the last century, but with consequences now that may be even harder to pull out of than they were then. And so, again, we feel it in the same way that perhaps dimly crabs or frogs that are being boiled in a pot feel gradually that it's getting hotter in here, right? We're sensing all the different ways in which inequality and the things that we see in the headlines and the tensions are playing out in our lives. They're playing out in everything, right? Not just big P political questions, but, gosh, how am I going to afford to send my kid to the University of Washington? Or how am I going to afford, if I teach here at the University of Washington, to live in Seattle? Or if I'm going to work at the University of Washington or at Stanford or wherever it may be, how am I going to actually afford childcare? Or how am I going to be able to get a job at all and raise a family when the jobs that are out there for somebody without a certain amount of education are paying wages that are in real terms essentially what they were 40 years ago, even as the cost of living, housing, raising a family, caring for one's own health have risen exponentially. So we all feel this in a very personal human way, but I think this is not inconsequential for any conversation about civics and civic education, right? Civic education does not exist in a bubble. It's education for understanding the society we live in right now. And we live in this remarkably bifurcating society right now. A lot of you have been either reading or, more like me, reading about this book by Thomas Piketty, Capital. That's everybody, it is this generation's big celebrity academic book. And if those of you don't know what I'm talking about, it's a book by a French economist, Thomas Piketty, who, along with another economist, Emmanuel Saez from UC Berkeley, has done over the past 6, 7, 8 years some groundbreaking economic research using tax records and a lot of data to really quantify the spread of inequality in this country. And they've really broken down the ways in which not just the 1%, but the 1% of the 1% have been able to accrue the gains that they've had over the last 3-4 decades. This book that Piketty has written himself, called Capital, is nothing short of a revolution in traditional economic thinking about the nature of inequality. And to give you a real thumbnail of it, the book argues essentially that this period that we had, particularly in the United States, but I think, well, let's just focus on the United States, this period that we had after World War II, from about 1945 to maybe the mid-1970s, that we think of as this great period where all boats were rising on being lifted on a rising tide, where there was more equitably shared opportunity, where there was a vision that there could be prosperity for all, and where really the idea of the American dream was, if not born, at least solidified as an expectation. That period, it turns out, if you take the long view of history, not just American history, but European history, may turn out to be this weird, anomalous blip. That really what the lesson and the patterns of history are, economic history, political economy, both in our country and through Western Europe, is really a tendency for, he has it in a very simple formula, that R is always greater than G, where R represents the rate of return on capital, and G represents the growth in real wages. So that over time, those who earn their money by having capital make more money faster than those who have to work for a living. That's the kind of bottom line formula of his analysis. And what that means is that over time, he's given clear data and kind of econometric force to the notion that the tendency of things in an economy is for the rich to get richer and the poor to get poorer, right? And this notion that we had in America, coming out of our exceptional period post-war, that there was a thing of the American, such as the American dream, that everybody could make and that everybody could have increasing prosperity, whether they were capitalists or workers, may indeed turn out to have been, as I say, anomalous. Well, there's been a lot of debate about this book and a lot of hand-wringing and reckoning with what are the consequences of this. If this is true, what do we do about this? Not only at the level of public policy, but also at the level of norms, social norms. How do we sustain an idea of shared identity if what we're doing as a country is reverting to what every other country eventually gets to, which is a widening spread and a concentration, a self-compounding concentration of wealth at the very top? Well, because Piketty is a Frenchman reckoning with the crisis of American democracy and economy, it's made a lot of people, including me, pull off their shelves the work of another Frenchman who was reckoning in his time with American democracy, and that's, of course, Tocqueville. And so actually last week, knowing that we were going to be spending some time together here, I pulled off the shelf for the first time, I admit, in a long time, my Democracy in America, and we just started to leaf through it the same kind of hopscotch way I've been leafing through Thomas Piketty's equally long 700-page book. And as I was leafing through and kind of hopscotching through Democracy in America, a couple things struck me that are, again, pertinent to our moment right now, the opportunities and the challenges of our moment. Because the moment that we have right now is not just this period of nearly unprecedented inequality and concentration of wealth and power. It's also a period where you begin to recognize, when you read Tocqueville and you read his incredibly praising words about the nature of American civic republicanism, about the ways that Americans at that time were joiners. They were citizens in the most active sense. They kind of, like it was a rash, organizations were spreading all over the country where people were just forming clubs and associations and groups of all different affinities. And there was this incredibly rich civic ecosystem at that time, which he believed at the associational level fed the habits, both of heart and mind, of effective citizenship in politics. And that this was a real eye-opener to this aristocrat from France to see this leveling, incredibly participatory spirit of civic republicanism, right? And so people who today like to quote Tocqueville usually quote Tocqueville in essentially elegiac terms, right? In a spirit of a lament, like, man, how far have we fallen, right? How far have we fallen from the day when Tocqueville could come and go to any small town in America and see people joining and showing up and participating and debating. Wow, we really have lost something. I actually read Tocqueville differently when I reread it this time now, juxtaposing it next to Piketty. And maybe this is my just optimistic nature, my glass half full way of seeing things. But when I read Tocqueville this time, I came to see that, yes, he may have been describing a reality at that time, but what he was describing was essentially the behaviors and actions of a fairly small group of propertied white, mainly men, who were the public in public life at that time, right? And granted, that's no small thing, again, set against the history of monarchy and despotism that this country escaped from. It was no small thing that even that relatively small group of white men at that time could manage to make a civic republic really work, right? That was worth every ounce of praise that Tocqueville bestowed upon it at that time. But let's be really clear. That was literally child's play compared to the task that we have today. And I see this not, again, in daunting terms, but in sort of exciting terms, that we are getting, again, congratulations, we are living through historic times, we are getting, our generation, to prove the proposition that it is possible for a mass, diverse, multicultural nation to still be a republic. Now, I've just put that in the affirmative in a positive kind of, exciting, hopeful way. You can also put that in the, either negative or more kind of interrogative, which is it going to be possible for a mass, diverse, continental, multicultural nation to maintain the spirit, the practices, and the skills of being a republic? Right? That's the question we get to answer over the rest of our lifetimes in all the work that we do. And I really do believe it's an exciting moment, even if you put it in the negative or the interrogative, because we're not the I think somewhat apocryphal Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, right? We are living in interesting times in America. And this is an interesting time to try to prove this proposition. And the reality is, never before in the history of Earth has this been tried. There have been mass multicultural continental scale empires. And, I know we can get into some quarrels about whether America is an empire and so on and so forth, but at the level of domestic politics, it has not been tried before to do something of this kind. And so we are truly inheritors of the next generation of an experiment that even our founders, let alone second-generation visitors like Tocqueville, could not really have conceived would grow to this kind of scale and to this scale of consequence. So that's our moment. Well, I think the second thing that I come to realize now is, given this moment, given this opportunity and challenge, and given also the fact that inequality is stretching us apart and fragmenting our culture in so many ways, what is the glue? What will hold us together? What can be that glue? And when you look around in American life right now, there are a few candidates for what you would call the glue. The most obvious candidate, and probably the most reflexive way that people think of themselves as bound together in this country, quite frankly, is the marketplace, is in our lives as consumers, right? And the little bit of psychological comfort you can get from landing in any town in the United States and finding a Subway or a Starbucks or a Panera or whatever it is, right? And feeling like, oh yeah, okay, that's I know where I am, right? And I suppose on one level that is something. It's better than absolutely nothing, I guess, but that is rather thin gruel for glue, right? That idea that our identities as consumers of national chains constitutes the heart of our national identity, of our national citizenship, is deeply unsatisfying, right? And so the idea that capitalism itself could be our glue is illusory. In fact, if anything, in spite of the fact that capitalism does generate certain unifying national experiences or uniform brand identities like that, the real force of capitalism is in fact to fragment us further, because the marketplace is unrelenting in its drive to slice us into ever smaller niches and sell to us in ever finer little subcategories. And the arrival of the internet makes that all the more possible to divide us into finer-grained little micro-demographics. And so capitalism is not our friend if your task is to be the glue or to find the glue or to hold us together. Well, what else? What else might be the glue? Well, you think, well, maybe religion. America remains, compared to certainly Europe and Asia, an exceptionally religious nation, right? But it takes about 2 seconds of thought to realize the ways in which that's not going to work either. Not only, number one, because the diversity of our faith lives in this country has grown and blossomed in just the way that the diversity of our ethnic demography has. We may be a religious nation, but we are no longer solely a Christian nation. The Supreme Court's recent rulings notwithstanding, the comfort that Americans have generally with imposing a particular faith on other people in the public sphere is still pretty low. People still feel a little bit sheepish about pushing their faith on other people in public. So religion is not going to be a particularly effective glue for holding us together, and frankly, nor should it be. That was not the point. In fact, it was quite not the point of the formation of our country. Well, then what else? What else might be the glue for us? Well, I think about this, and it returns so much to the kinds of things that Jim Banks and Bill Damon and so many of our colleagues in this work have been thinking about, practicing, writing for so long. And it is actually a set of ideas that in its own way comes partly out of Tocqueville, but partly out of other figures throughout American history. And that is, in my view, that the only hope that we have for a sustainable, durable glue in this country is not capitalism and it's not religion, but it is what I would call civic religion. I do believe that this country, even if it's often not acknowledged or named, has a civic religion. We have a creed. And the creed is stated in some ways. One way to articulate the creed, as Bill Damon did so succinctly and powerfully, is to talk about the tensions, fundamental tensions between our two great ideals of liberty and equality. These are the kind of poles of our American identity, and yet recognizing that just as with magnetic poles, there is kind of reverberance and tension and static between those. But another way to think about the creed, of what it means to be American, is simply to go through what I consider various texts of civic scripture, if I may extend the analogy. And I don't mean scripture from the Old or New Testament. I mean scripture from the preamble of the Constitution. I mean scripture in the sense of the Declaration of Independence. I mean the words of the Gettysburg Address. I mean the language, the cadence, the literary and cultural allusions that are woven and embedded throughout in kind of subversively patriotic ways by Martin Luther King in the I Have a Dream speech. There are texts in American life that are as central to our creed and that contain in as powerfully distilled a way a set of values and a set of virtues as any passage of the Bible does for a Christian faith. And yet this idea that there is an American creed and that it falls upon us to sustain that creed, to return to it, to examine it, to interrogate it, to challenge ourselves to live up to it, is something that we've fallen a bit out of the habit of doing and thinking and talking about. And so this brings me finally to the third point that I wanted to really make today, which is what our task is. Our task is nothing less than to revivify the creed, to catalyze a revival of this civic religion, a belief that there is something exceptional and powerful about the idea and the promise of this country. And that idea itself of American exceptionalism, I know, has gotten so politically freighted and itself a partisan political football. But to me, it is incontrovertible that, at least in its original purpose, this country is exceptional because, to quote President Lincoln, This country was dedicated to a proposition at the outset. It was not formed out of ancient mists of blood and territory and tribe. It was formed partly by choice, partly by oppression, partly with high ideals and partly with profound hypocrisy. But it was dedicated to a proposition. And our challenge as Americans in reclaiming the creed is not simply to say, okay, let's rewind the clock socially, politically, ethically to 1950 and just celebrate America in a blind, kind of unthinking way. That's not our task. When I say revive the creed and revivify this civic religion, I mean it is time to redeem the creed. It is time to hold it up in a bright way again and behold it and say to ourselves, are we living up to this or not? What would it mean, in fact, to live up to this? What would it mean, in fact, to make good on the words of the I Have a Dream speech? We sit here today almost not paying attention to the fact that we're in the 50th anniversary year of some consequential acts of the civil rights movement, some consequential legislation of the civil rights movement. Nobody thinks our work is done, but no one has a clear idea for this next 50 years of what it will mean to redeem the creed. That's our task. It is our task to start thinking about that and our task to demand that the people, whether they are young people in our charge or our peers around us, that others also dedicate themselves to the work of redeeming the creed rather than writing it off. And here's the reality. This creed, I do believe, is worth redeeming. And I say that not, again, as a blind booster of American history. I understand everything that is good, bad, and ugly about this country's history. In the news a couple weeks ago, the Chinese laborers who helped build the Transcontinental Railroad were finally given official recognition by the U.S. Department of Labor for their hand, literally, in uniting the country in that way. Right? And we think, okay, that's progress. And yet, at the very same time, yesterday, when I was down at the University of Oregon, one of the winners of the Ansel Payne Award for Ethics in Journalism, some of you may know Ansel Payne, who was a giant of Northwest journalism here running King 5 TV for many years. Two of the award winners for this Ethics in Journalism Award were two student journalists from the University of Alabama, editors and reporters at the Crimson White, which is the name of the school newspaper at Alabama. And they won this award because they broke the story at the beginning of the school year this year. They broke the story that some of you may have heard. They actually scooped the New York Times on this, which helped make it a national story, about how at the University of Alabama, the Greek system, the fraternities and sororities, to this day remain racially segregated. And what happened was that one sorority decided we want to break this tradition. We know this outstanding young woman who's African American, who we think should be part of our sorority. And steps began to be taken for this to happen. And then what happened? The power structure kicked in. The power structure not only of those on campus in this kind of interfraternal sorority Greek council, but the power structure, it turns out, that emanates from that. It turns out that a lot of Alabama politics is deeply woven into the Greek system of the University of Alabama. And it turns out that there are a lot of alumni who weren't comfortable with this step being taken. And it turned out that this step got quashed before it could happen. And so, on the one hand, you can celebrate the progress that we've made and the fact that this country does, even if it takes, 150 years, does finally kind of make good on its promise and recognize and reckon with its past. And yet, today, in Alabama, we still live with the remnants of that past in ways that color and poison and distort our notions of shared identity. Right? So I know well that we are not in some Pollyanna moment where the American creed is simply to be blindly celebrated. But it is precisely because time and time again, in form after form, right now as we speak in America, it's precisely because we are falling short of living up to the creed, that it is up to us to redeem it. That it is up to us to hold up the language and the ideals of liberty. And liberty not just as the removal of encumbrance, not just as get off my back, don't tread on me, but liberty as responsibility, liberty as the freedom to work together. That this creed of liberty and equality in fact and equality of opportunity, still demands redemption. That is our work. And when I think about what it means for us now to redeem that creed, it requires us to find a whole new language, right? And to really, in a sense, integrate thesis, antithesis into a new synthesis. The thesis was the original American creed, promulgated by white men of a long time ago. The antithesis has been, at least since the 1960s, with some antecedents before, a great movement of multiculturalism and diversity that is meant to change that story and diversify the narrative. Now we need a synthesis in which all of the force and beauty and vigor and power and diversity of our multicultural identity and our multicultural education and our multicultural mindsets today get applied and brought to bear on redeeming the creed and reimagining the creed, so that we can make those words mean something again, not only to us, but to those who we will be charged to teach and to form as the next generation of Americans. That is an idea that also is one of the kind of quietly provocative ideas that's embedded in this report, and one of the reasons why I think across left and right, as we in our group pull this document together, we were able to find interesting forms of common ground. Yes, interesting forms of controversy as well, but interesting forms of common ground. And I just want to close by reminding us all that for us, coupling power and character is central to citizenship. But then attaching that combination of power and character to a redeemed creed is what it means to make American citizenship matter again. Thank you very much.
Really lovely speech, and I wish I could listen to you another hour. And I'd like to continue the religious analogy and say, from my Black Baptist tradition, amen. And as you were talking, I thought of Gunnar Myrdal's work on the American Dilemma, and I think that we could sure go back and read that. The book has an incredible title, The American Dilemma and the Negro Problem in America. That tells a lot about the time. But I think Gunnar Myrdal and his notion of the American Dilemma was talking exactly about the American Creed that Eric was talking about. We're going to take, we started a little late, but we're going to just slightly modify the schedule. We have time because there's a closure for 30 minutes, and we're going to take about 10 minutes of questions for our two wonderful speakers. Again, I could have just kept listening for another hour, really. Let's start with our questions. We have a mic set up, and this is being taped, so please speak into the mic. First question. Karen Gord, a former research assistant and an art professor at University of Washington, Bothell. Karen.
I want to thank both of you for the comments that you were making, but I particularly want to pick up on the last idea that I heard Eric talking about.
Can you hear her in the back? Is that mic on? It doesn't sound like it's on.
I can probably just talk. I do have this. So I wanted to pick up on the last idea that Eric mentioned about needing a new language. And throughout what you were saying, Bill, and what Eric was saying, I kept thinking about it goes deeper than this. We need to think about, instead of thinking about citizenship education as a noun, to be thinking of it as a verb, because I see this linear process where we say, okay, we need to educate people in a way that addresses the civic education, and then they can take action. But I actually would like to pose that perhaps the civic education itself is part of that action. And so instead of forming things as debate, we can form those as discussions, negotiations, as listening, meaning truly listening to what diverse voices are saying. And I didn't think of Gunnar democracy. And his, it's been a while since I picked up democracy in education and read it. But, the basic concept that I took away from it was that we can't define democracy as a thing, because it's going to change. As soon as you change that population, and people are the ones who are in control of what that democracy looks like, then it's no longer going to be the same thing as it was a few years ago. And so I think we do need a new language, but part of that new language is just changing our traditions of using things like the age, which are part of that binary, right? We say, oh, there's this position or this position. People are much more complex. When we think about human development, we change over time. We're in different places.
So could you focus the question, Karen?
Yeah, well, the question is just how do we actually change our concept, even in a conference like this, about how we're talking about citizenship education? Sorry.
Is the mic on, Mary?
I don't think so. There. Can you hear me now? Yeah. So thank you for that question. I agree that, I certainly agree with the idea of verb, not noun, and dynamic process, not fixed entity. And I think that there are many ways to build what my friend Damon calls our citizen muscle, right? To kind of key off of some of Bill's work and the work of colleagues of his, like Carol Dweck at Stanford, who talks about certain capacities, whether it's intelligence or imagination, and how we add to that kind of civic efficacy as not a thing that is a fixed entity that either you're born with or without, or have a certain amount of, but it is a malleable thing that you grow by exercise, right? And I agree that there are many forms of exercise. I mean, debate is one of them, but negotiation is another, and there are many flavors and forms of what it means to actually engage one another in the work of making decisions together. So I would agree with that. The thing that I would say, though, about new language, when I talk about the creed in particular, there is a word that is an old word and has something of a, I suppose, regular people here perhaps, a negative valence, but I do want to reclaim. I don't want to throw out this word. I want to reappropriate it, and that is Americanization. Americanization used to mean kind of, enforced waspification, right? Assimilation not only to certain notions of whiteness, but to certain kind of, lost notions of whiteness that would take, nominally white people from, Italy or Ireland or Greece and make them less Southern European, less Jewish, less this, less that, right? And certainly as immigration in this country became more than just European, that word and idea got a bad rap for very good reasons. But I don't want to throw out that word. I think we have to have, and this is what I mean about synthesis, we have to have confidence in ourselves as multiculturalists to believe that Americanization is a thing worth salvaging. And that what we are doing here in this country by creating a multicultural identity that still has bonds of unity is showing the world how to do something that hasn't been done. And I want to put that name on it. So anyway, that's perhaps I've opened up another can of worms. But I did want to return to that in the language.
I can't resist just making a couple comments on what Eric said. I was going to totally end the question, but now I can't resist. Just one quick thing about language and the modes of discourse in the New World, and I'm very sensitive to this coming from Silicon Valley, is that social media is going to play a big part of this. So we need to figure, we, society, educators, everybody, we need to figure a way to make these forms of action effective and universal through the media that young people are now using, which is Facebook, Twitter, etc. So that's a bit, I think that's one part of the answer to this new approach that you asked about. And the second thing posted my view on it as Eric, and yet he seems to get away with that without getting everybody mad at it.
Yeah.
I can't figure out how he does it.
Right.
So I'm going to try to learn that from him.
Right. Thank you very much. And I would love, Eric and I are going to have lunch, because I love his idea of reclaiming these words that have been co-opted by the extreme assimilationists. But how do we reclaim Americanization? That would be a fascinating conversation. We'll have to have lunch. Professor Lance Bennett.
Thanks to both of you for very interesting remarks and for the report for pointing out that we need to get real. And the question is, how do we get real? And how real can we get? For those educators and civic workers in the crowd, a couple of things have crossed my screen lately. One is a map of the world done in Gini coefficients, in which levels of inequality are compared. And we're on par with Russia. We're not far from China and Mexico. So that's serious. And it's serious because that inequality, as we all know, has converted itself into political power imbalances. So if we want to get real, I mean really real, I think we need more than a new vocabulary. I don't think that the vocabulary of patriotism and American ethos is going to cut it. I think we've lost the republic. The second thing across my screen lately was a series of political science studies. Yes, political science finally caught up with reality. And those studies suggest that we are an oligarchy. Now, republic is one thing, oligarchy is another. Dare we call it that? Dare we look at the evidence and realize that some tiny elite in this country are massively overrepresented, and below the bottom third to one-half are negatively represented? Get your mind around that. How do you have negative political representation? So if students are going to get on board with this, I think we've got to get real. And then the question is there enough space and freedom in the public schools to talk like that?
Either you want to respond.
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate the sentiment. I think it gets to the gravity of our current, as Eric said, we are living in historic times, and we've got a problem. And I think that comment absolutely underlines that, and I agree with the concern. I don't agree that the idea of the American tradition has nothing to say about that. I have no hesitancy to say that, for example, disenfranchising people by all the various economic and political tricks that are being used right now, like voter registration stuff, all that nonsense, that's un-American. I don't have a problem with that, and I would defend that statement according to all the great American traditions that have progressively enfranchised people in the spirit of the Constitution. So I feel that a lot of the ugly stuff that's going on right now by folks in Washington is actually divergent from the great American tradition. And to me, that's a powerful way of getting the point across that we need to go in a new direction.
I first want to say amen of my own to the last thing that Bill said, which is the idea that this language of American identity and what the American creed is supposed to mean does have something powerful and important to say in response to the circumstances of our time. It is literally un-American, the kind of breaking of the game that we have right now. And if we want to actually, in real terms, win elections and elect leaders who get real themselves, who reckon with the brokenness and the riggedness of the game, we do that by deploying the language of what's American, number one. That's just at a level of kind of political rhetoric. But I want to tell you about, just an example of getting real here in our own city. So I had the good fortune to serve over the last number of months on Mayor Ed Murray's task force here in the city, in Seattle, to get us to a $15 minimum wage. Some of you probably have been following the news. We struck a deal, a business labor deal start on several levels. Number one, the number, which would set the wage at the highest level, so any city, major city in the United States. But number two, that it really was a business labor deal, that we got people across the spectrum to get behind this, even though it was hard and it was pulling teeth and it was a compromise that grew out of debate. And all the kind of traditions and habits of what it means to be a citizen. But the reason why we did this, the reason why this has been a central priority for me to get involved and roll up my sleeves and to practice some of what I've been preaching is that I couldn't agree more with Lance that we have to find opportunities in real politics to start pushing back against oligarchy, pushing back against concentration of wealth, and pushing back against these structural inequities that are perpetuating self-compounding in our politics. This, to me, is one way to do that. Is it a silver bullet? No. Are there qualms and questions about raising the minimum wage? Sure. But getting real means getting in there into the arena. And that can be at a local level on something like $15 measure. It might be doing something national, like my friend and colleague who's been part of the work at Citizen University, Larry Lessig, law professor at Harvard, crusader on campaign finance reform, who's been not only talking and teaching and publishing on this stuff, but has created some of the most innovative civic social ventures out there to combat our rigged campaign finance system. So he has created this new, what he's called the May Day PAC, that was launched on May 1st. And it is, by his telling, a super PAC to end all super PACs. They're trying to raise giant amounts of money to support candidates who will commit to supporting campaign finance to fight fire with fire, in a sense. Now, again, you might quarrel with the tactics. You might think, oh, there's a better way to do this or whatever. But he's showing up. He's engaging. He's going from ideas to practice. And I think that is crucially important to build that bridge from idea to practice. And it goes back to the earlier comment we had, kind of duty in terms. The best way to make some of this stuff real when we talk about American identity is to get out there and do democracy in these ways.
I have an announcement. I wish we could continue this discussion, but we have another panel. We're going to take a short break, and then those of you, a few of you came in late, make sure you stop and get a copy, a package, so that you can get the publication. Let's give these wonderful presenters our hand. And our next session will start, let's cut our break to 7 minutes rather than 10, so that Professor Catherine Mitchell and her group can get started. Please now move to our second plenary session, being chaired by one of my very dear and respected colleagues, Professor Catherine Mitchell, who is Professor of Geography at the University of Washington, or the UW as we say. She is a leading and international known scholar who studies migration, education, and urban political geography. She studies the philosophies and practices related to immigrant integration, and also questions related to hegemony, particularly the role of schools and other institutions in the formation of contemporary citizens. Her prior work focused on transnational migration and urbanization, and these topics continue to interest her. Professor Mitchell's books include Practicing Public Scholarship, Experiences and Possibilities Beyond the Academy, Crossing the Neoliberal Line, Pacific Rim Migration in the Metropolis, Life's Works, Geography of Social Reproduction, and her Harvard Educational Review article about Hong Kong immigrants in Vancouver I use in my seminar. She is a popular professor among my students in my seminar on multicultural education across nations. I'm delighted to introduce my friend and colleague, Professor Catherine Mitchell.
Thanks very much, Jim. It's an honor to be here, and I really look forward to hearing what the panel is going to say today. I was told to be very strict with time and not to go on and on about introductions, so that we have time to question these brilliant speakers. I'm just going to give you their names and titles and introduce them one by one. The first speaker we have is Professor Lance Bennett. Professor of Political Science and the Lawrence Professor of Communications and Director at the Center for Communications and Civic Engagement at UW. And I think he's written so many books and articles that we don't really need to go over them. Everybody knows his work well, and I'm just going to allow him to come up here. Do you want to sit there, or you want to come up here? Probably better to come up here. And please welcome Dr. Bennett.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, I'm going to tell you a story in 3 parts. It's a story about running a Center for Communication and Civic Engagement, which has gone out into the world, into the schools, into the community, that was started about 15 years ago, and I'm glad Susan Jeffords is back. Shout out for you, Susan. It's because of Susan that this center exists, so I appreciate very much your patron status in our enterprise. And the idea of communication and civic engagement, I think, echoes some of what Eric said a minute ago, is that we need language. The question is, what kind of language? And over the years, we've talked about how to help different communities, different kinds of citizens, find languages. I think there are multiple languages at work here, to define issues, to talk about them, to present and share them, and to get the skills they need through things like video storytelling, and then to understand networking, organization, and advocacy. Now, at some point in that long list of communication skills, the schools start dropping out. Advocacy usually is the defining border in all of this. But the first part of this story is starting about 2001. I was blessed with some grants from Pew and Annenberg to go into the schools and see how we could create these languages and these communication processes and actually break down the walls between the schools and the communities in which they exist. We found 17 teachers in 17 Seattle high schools who are willing to do this experiment. And they were wonderful teachers and actually quite successful in all cases. We quickly learned that the private schools didn't need us, so we said goodbye happily to them because they were doing it already, many of them. The publics were more of a mixed bag. We realized quickly that the languages involved in some of the central and south end schools it was a different vocabulary, it was a different political reality indeed that we were confronting. Many of the teachers were frustrated because the materials they had for teaching civics didn't work for their kids at all. In fact, studies have shown that a lot of the civics that's taught in an academic way actually has negative outcomes for lower class kids, for kids from underserved communities, negative outcomes. It turns them off to participation. So I think we really need to start with the materials we use, the books we use, the kinds of discourse in those materials, and get kids out into the world. We had one particularly interesting class at Franklin High who were sort of in full-scale rebellion in their own civics class, which was kind of a civic act. I mean, we admired that, but we didn't think that it was putting this to very productive ends. So I had enough money that I assigned a full-time research assistant to work with this class and their teacher. And we found that, yes, they were concerned about things that were political, but they didn't understand them quite as political issues. Armed guards in the schools frustrated them. Police profiling frustrated them. So we asked them finally, what would you like to do? Well, we'd like to talk to the police chief about profiling. Good. What kind of a setting would you like to talk to the police chief in? Well, we don't know. So we finally developed that they could do a talk show. So they instantly knew that vocabulary, that logic. So they knew that they needed a talent booker, they needed a writer, they needed a producer, they needed somebody who could do the camera. They put it together on their own, and it turns out the police chief was their first guest. And it turns out the Seattle Channel ran this show for most of their school year. And they were really excited because they were getting real people talking about real subjects in their lives. The project, it turns out, was too expensive to sustain, unfortunately. So the good news is that it worked for pretty much everybody we tried it with. The bad news is that it cost $700,000, and the Seattle schools, of course, couldn't afford that luxury. And so at the end of a very happy run in which we had a lot of engaged kids who were doing some really interesting projects and learning how to deal with their own political realities, which are very different from place to place and community to community. So that was the ending of part one of this story. You can do it, but it takes money and it takes intensive work with the discovery of the language and the in the real world experiences that make sense to different youth groups. Chapter 2 is, after our adventure in the public schools, we went out into the community thinking, well, that's where the kids are, they're online. There was also firewalls in the schools and political pressures that teachers experience. That made it very difficult to transition from the school to the real world in teaching civics. So MacArthur actually was reinventing its concept of civic learning, stopping to call it education and calling it learning, and we're open to the idea that learning can take place anywhere and it doesn't have to be in the schools. So we partnered with the city of Seattle, who was exploring creative ways of harvesting the Comcast cable license money and purposing it for community and youth activities. And we partnered with the Seattle Metro Y, and I give them a shout out to the Y crew, Colleen and company. You want to raise your hands? So talk to these people because they're working with serious, interesting civic engagement projects at the Seattle Y. And we developed, in partnership with the Y, the city, and some other groups, a online youth commons called Puget Sound Off, in which kids could learn these skills, and we had a whole program that was kind of our dream if we weren't burdened by the textbooks and the academic lessons that turn many of the kids we wanted to reach off. What could we actually do in terms of self-teaching and then finding community organizations that are working with youth to implement this curriculum for advocacy? So the end goal was youth advocating their own causes. It turns out that was also really quite successful. It's still running. It's been reinvented. And we are hoping to partner with teachers who want to get kids out into the online world, but also out into their own communities to work up their own strategies for advocating their causes. So talk to Colleen and company from the Y. So that's a little happier story. That one is still out there. We work with them in a program here at UW, also thanks in part to Susan and to Anna Marie Kause, called Becoming Citizens. Although we've sort of changed the title of that because we realize that a lot of the youth we work with are immigrant community youth, and Becoming Citizens has a certain connotation for them. So we again are sort of examining what language do we use to deal with politics when kids don't have a political vocabulary they're comfortable with, because most of it comes from adults they don't particularly want to identify with. So we have learned, and this is part 3 of my short story, a lot of things about language and about language that kids regard as real for them. And the first thing we learned is that the entire vocabulary of politics that comes through most civics courses is not their comfort vocabulary. It just doesn't work for them. They actually negatively react to it in many cases, especially the kids we would like to serve in civic education and engagement programs. The kids who are going to participate anyway get A's in civics classes, and so academically it's working for them, and it matches what they go on to experience in the real world. But my question is, what about the rest of the kids, the most important citizens we could perhaps reach in these causes? So I'm going to leave you with what I've learned in this decade of youth civic work, and it is that the vocabulary of citizenship that we've had for almost 100 years now, the modern era dutiful citizen, and you all know what that means if I just say the term dutiful citizen, is gone. It works for most of us in this room because we're still in that generation. We're still in institutions where that makes sense and we can affirm it with each other. But for the generations coming online now, the millennials in particular, it's gone. They don't read newspapers. They do get informed, but that's a different story. As Bill said, they aren't voting enthusiastically. They could, but the system doesn't work for them, so why should they? So if we're going to get real, we might as well understand that democracy isn't working for most citizens today. So if our civic education doesn't reflect that, and if we don't have a language we can learn to talk about it in, we're going to miss the kids. And so what I've learned is that in this transitional moment where the languages and the practices and the skills of dutiful citizenship are in decline, they're transitioning out, what's replacing them? Well, the problem is that those of us who are educators are continuing to reinvent that same language, and it's not working real well, but we don't have a good next language. I respect what Eric said about, let's go back and rekindle some of the patriotic fuel, but we need a bridge language to get young people to that. And what I've learned is that they're making it up. Sometimes it works well, Occupied America, and raised our discourse on inequality. It was a DIY movement, and it was very much not a movement that was engaged with the traditional conventional modes of civic action. And so we should begin looking at the DIY examples that young people in particular are offering us and begin to understand how these languages make sense to them, and then begin connecting them with some of the languages of the Republic that we might want to restore the meaning to. Thanks very much.
So I think we'll wait for questions until the end of all the speakers. And thank you, Lance. And hold your questions for the end. Our next speaker is Dafney Blanca Dabach, Dr. Dafney Blanca Dabach, an assistant professor of education at the University of Washington. Thanks.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Excellent. Thank you and good morning. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be with you all today. Today I'll be highlighting 2 points made by this report and speaking from my perspective as a scholar of immigration and education. I'll be adding a 3rd point for consideration based on my work. And finally, I'll be offering up 2 questions for consideration that I hope will keep the significant work, the significant dialogue moving forward. 2 highly significant points of many.
It's a little close to the mic. Let's just step back. Okay, perfect.
2 highly significant points of many that this report makes can be summarized in their simplest forms as 2 propositions. Number 1, civic education matters, and power matters. These abbreviated propositions are not comprehensive, nor do they reflect the nuances and variation in perspectives of contributors, but nonetheless offer points of departure for thinking about civic education in our time. First, on civic education mattering, the report highlights how, in the current educational climate, the excessive focus on high-stakes testing has squeezed out time and resources for citizenship education. And that, quote, public schools today have distanced themselves from their once central civic mandate. Reading this, I too went back to my bookshelf and pulled Dewey off the shelf, right? Thinking about issues of conjoined common experiences, yes? So I also appreciated the opportunity for the report to send me back to these really important foundational works too. The publication and dissemination of this report works to highlight the significant problem for the health of our democracy. It allows an important opportunity to explicitly take up this issue that was once the cornerstone of public schooling. Civic education matters for building a democracy that reflects our aspirations of shared governance and collective societal endeavors that transcend individual interests. Second, on power mattering, the report directly asserts that power matters, and it's wonderful to get the backstory, too, about how Eric was contributing this really important idea. The report directly asserts that power matters and that the workings of power should be taught. To quote, civic and political competence require understanding how power works, who has it, and how it can be attained. This is not achieved when the emphasis of civic engagement is limited to volunteer work and apolitical community service. This focus on power is bold and necessary. It acknowledges what many of us know to be true, particularly in the workings of government, but also in our daily lives and in schooling, especially as related to the various ways that social inequalities continue to show up in schools and how this intersects with unequal power relations. This notion of power mattering is also significant for understanding the relationship between inequality and democracy, as others here have already pointed out today. Now, if I were to add a third proposition, complementary alongside these, in addition to civic matters and civic education matters and power matters, it would be context matters. In relation to my field of immigration and education, I think about Irene Bloomrad's innovative research that investigates how contexts matter for immigrant incorporation within societies. Her scholarship that compares the US and Canada as distinct contexts of reception for immigrants highlight how even when immigrants' origins are exactly the same, Canada has higher rates of naturalization and also higher measures of civic participation from naturalized immigrants. From my work on the Spencer-funded Civic Lessons in Immigrant Youth Study, I will offer another education-based example on the significance of context. Our research team, composed of Eliza Phones, Natasha Hakimali Merchant, and MJ Kim, if you're here, please wave. Thank you for all your amazing work in this, what's been an amazing collective venture. Our research team has recently written about how undocumented youth were silent during class discussions that raised issues directly about immigration policy, in which they held a clear stake. So imagine this. In a classroom, the subject of debate is, and the subject on the floor is actually immigration policy, and yet students are silent who have a direct stake in this. So we need to ask ourselves some questions here. Yet, despite their silence in the classroom, in other settings, they were quite vocal and had lots to say. So again, pointing to how context matters. Context, though, is not only about geographic locations, but differentiated settings with sets of affordances and limitation. And this here really points nicely to some of the work that Lance was just describing. So the purpose here is not only to deliberate what should be taught and why, as important as those are, but also, for me, accepting the task of a researcher, inquiring how civic development happens, and especially under what circumstances. If we think more about the affordances and limitations of distinct contexts, then we might be able to improve civic education by creating hybrid spaces that build off of the affordances and limitations of different places, including classrooms, community centers, and other public or collective gathering places. You might think here, for example, about this as an extension of the work that our colleague Phil Bell already does in science, or literacy scholars such as Chris Gutierrez here, where the kernel of the idea is to take a domain of knowledge, so in their case science or literacy, and here it would be civics, and really think about how, if we really pay attention to youth and the various contexts in which they navigate, we can even sometimes rethink our own notions of what that domain of knowledge is even about. So it could involve an epistemological shift here. The point, for example, might not only be modeling government, student government, for example, off of US adult forms, but working bidirectionally across different spaces that youth inhabit and contribute to in collective ways. I also want to offer a friendly challenge to rethink the way that we characterize youth so often as civically engaged versus apathetic. I appreciated the earlier comment noting the variation, right, in youth civic participation. Characterizing youth as civically engaged versus apathetic does not actually allow us to recognize when they are in fact engaged. Perhaps the tools we use to measure standard forms of engagement do not necessarily capture the nuances and varieties of how and where and when youth are engaged. And yet, I also recognize that there is indeed a great deal of variation in the extent to which youth experience empowerment. Myra Levinson refers to this as a civic empowerment gap rather than a civic engagement gap. Finally, I would like to close. I would like to also offer two questions to further this dialogue. First, what are our underlying notions of how civic development occurs? If we connect civic development to other forms of learning and development, then the concept of apprenticeship may be helpful here. This apprenticeship may not necessarily be from elders to youth, but a bidirectional relationship. For example, just as youth learn from their high school civics teacher how to write letters to elected officials on issues that they care about, raising their voices and making their voices heard. Adults may learn from youth about collective forms of participation. I know I myself have learned a great deal from youth. And then also to add here, particularly in thinking about immigrant communities, I mean, Margaret Mead wrote over half a century ago about how, particularly in immigrant communities, it's often the youth teaching the elders. So we might want to play with that notion here and think about what that means in this context here for civics. In closing, I would like to thank Professor James Banks for the invitation to speak here today. I thank the consensus report's authors for aiming to raise the salience of civic education and development, as well as the co-panelists here and audience members, all of you, for being here to participate in this event. And I share my hope that these important conversations will continue long after the ink dries on this important report's printing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dafney. And our next speaker is Dr. Luis Fraga, the Russell F. Stark University Professor and Director, Diversity Research Institute at UW.
I was hoping that I could read the text on the slides. I'm not going to read you the text on the slides, but I was hoping that I could see it without my reading glasses, but apparently that's not the case. Thank you very much to Jim Banks and the Center for Multicultural Education for this opportunity to be here with you today. The comments that I have decided to share with you directly relate to an important component of the report that is the focus of our meeting, and very much build upon the comments that Eric Liu made about the need for us to try to find a new discourse, a new language, and a new language grounded in new concepts of understanding what American citizenship, or whatever term one would like to use. I like the idea of civic religion. Since now I'm going to Notre Dame, I have to also acknowledge the importance of religion, including civic religion. Just joking with you. But I want to suggest that there may be a very significant source of insight as to how to rethink this idea of civic religion and the need to develop a new understanding of what it means to be American by looking at ethnic racial communities themselves. And today I'm going to focus on Latino communities and report on some research that I and colleagues have been doing that I think have some insights to provide to us as we think through this very, very important and timely question. There we go. This is an image of the protest in May 2006 in Los Angeles against House Resolution 4436, the resolution that would have made it a felony for anyone to be in the United States in unauthorized status, or a felony for anyone who gave them any support to anyone who was in unauthorized status. This is an image of active civic engagement that was entirely unpredicted by any social scientist, by any journalist, by any reporter, by any civic leader in the United States. We got it wrong. We didn't understand that specific issues can serve as a catalyst. You can't see them here. A lot of those folks are youth. A lot of those folks are youth who were undocumented. A lot of those folks were youth who were documented. It was a multiracial group, largely immigrant origin. This was an example across the entire country. By some estimates, 3 to 5 million people who on a particular day decided to make their voices known in an act of true civic engagement. This was a sign of these individuals offering us a new understanding of the American dream. It was a sign of respect for American political institutions and a sign of hope in those institutions by taking the action that they did on the streets. Now, not everyone agreed with this. Certainly we know, now deceased, former professor of mine, Sam Huntington, who wrote in his book, Who Are We?, that there is no Americano dream. There is no way of thinking of revitalizing, re-energizing, if you will, this civic narrative of the American dream if you don't think in traditionalist terms exclusively. He said there is no Americano dream, there is only the American dream created by an Anglo-Protestant society. Mexican Americans, the focus of a particular chapter in his book, will share in that dream and in that society only if they dream in English and adopt traditional American civic values. The photo that I just showed you shows how wrong this particular comment was 2 years before that protest actually occurred. An alternative way to understanding what the opportunities are that we now have to develop a new civic discourse I think, are captured effectively by this quote from a book, American Progressivism, by Roberto Mangabeda Unger, formerly, I think, or maybe still, a Harvard law professor, and Cornel West, a professor of religious studies and African American studies at Princeton University, where in their book they say, to understand your country, you must love it. To love it, you must, in a sense, accept it. To accept it as it is, however, is to betray it. To accept your country without betraying it, you must love it for that in it which shows what it might become. That's the challenge. And that's the opportunity. So well articulated by Eric Liu. That's the challenge and the moment that we have. So where can we look to try to gain further insights? We can look to traditional texts, as was suggested, for insight as to how to do it. I want to suggest to you we can look to immigrant communities themselves and ethnic racial communities themselves as a complement, not as an alternative, as a complement for insight as to how to rethink citizenship, civic education, and I think in a way that might speak directly to youth and provide them a way of identifying personally with this new important challenge that we have. Now, I know my time is running slightly short, and I only have about 53 other slides to show you, so I'm going to apologize in advance for running through some slides. It's not 53. It's actually 23 slides to show you. But I want to give you a sense of some of the data. So I'll ask your forgiveness if I run through some of the data quickly. All of this is public. Just write me. I'm happy to send it to you, and I assure you it's all accurate. As was stated earlier, we're in a very significant multicultural moment. These are data on the, let's see, oh, here we go. We even have a pointer. These are data on the trends in population demographics in the United States. This is the line for whites, Caucasians. This is the line for Latinos, the focus of my comments to you today. This is the line for African Americans, the lines for Africans and African Americans, for Asians and Asian Americans. Our country is shifting dramatically. And the although the specific numbers may vary depending upon shifts in immigration policy and birth rates and so on, the general trends, I think it's fair to say, are going to continue. We are becoming increasingly multicultural as a society, and that is our future, as much as some folks might want to deny it. Much less well known in the case of Latinos is the extent to which it is also an extremely young population, especially relative to the white population in the United States, so that the importance of our questions today on youth civic engagement are especially significant to this community and to the future of the country, given how significant these youth are to increasing demographics in the United States. These data show as well that foreign-born Hispanics have a distribution in age that is quite distinct from U.S.-born Hispanics, a substantial percentage of whom are youth. In fact, 92.4%, according to a recent census estimate of Hispanics under the age of 18 in the United States, are born in the United States. So these are American citizens already, one might say, ripe for participation in American society if they are motivated in the right way. Now, what types of aspirations might this community have for the American dream? Taking data from a survey that I and 5 colleagues put together, the Latino National Survey in 2006, the largest ever survey of Latinos in the United States, a sample size of 8,624 respondents, state stratified, 15 states in the DC metro area. We asked questions about Americanness, citizenship, and identity. I want to share some of them with you because I think they're particularly relevant to our consideration today. We asked the question for those who immigrated to the United States, what's your reason for coming to the United States? By far the largest answer is to improve their economic situation. They're coming for the same reasons that immigrants have been coming to the United States for years and for generations. Yes, there's some political concern. Some are coming as political refugees or trying to gain political rights. But the largest reason is consistent with American history. They're coming for economic benefit and gain. In looking at reasons for becoming an American citizen, however, one sees that the right to vote and the attainment of legal, political, and civil rights begins to appear very quickly for this group. The politics, the citizenship, as traditionally understood in the United States, even though the motivation, if you will, for coming to the country initially is quite distinct. When asked the question, if Latinos work hard, can they get ahead in America? If Latinos work hard, they can get ahead in America. What you see here, and these answers are by generation. First generation means foreign-born. Second generation, born in the United States, but at least one parent who's foreign-born. Third generation, like me, born in the United States, parents born in the United States, but grandparents who immigrated. Fourth generation, people with grandparents who were there, and our sample size allows us to make those sorts of distinctions. What you see is that there is a tremendous consistency in the view that hard work is the key to success in the United States. When we ask questions about parents' aspirations of children's education, and we did this on purpose to see whether or not the attitudes of this particular community, growing in importance to the country, towards education was more consistent with what is reported by many educators, that parents don't know, these parents don't know how to help their children, don't aspire for their children. Two different questions, too often combined into one. We ask the question, how far would you like to see your child go in school? And you can see that the modal responses, if you will, the most significant responses are that they would like to see their children get a graduate or advanced degree or go to college. This is the case for the national sample, and especially the case for the immigrant generation, but also the case for increasing, for generations as they increase their presence here in the United States. We also ask the question, well, okay, it's nice to aspire, but how far do you think your child will actually go in school? And all the percentages drop slightly. There is still a tremendous faith in the possibility of upward mobility on the basis of education. The narrative is wrong. It is more consistent with the traditional narrative of America and the importance of education in the United States. Very quickly, because my time is short, we ask questions, do you agree that most people who don't get ahead should blame the system? You can see here that that they only have themselves to blame. There is a great sense of self-sufficiency that these data demonstrate. We also asked, do you think that it is not really a big problem if some people have more of a chance in life than others? And what you see here, again, is that there are views very consistent with the traditional American understanding of the American dream. I'm going to go through that quickly. Now, what's distinctive about the group? What I've just shown you are data that say their views are very consistent with those of the American dream. So where's the insight? Where's the newness? Where's the distinctiveness that might appear? Let me offer you some data to justify that. We asked the question, how important do you think it is that everyone in the United States learns English? So the response is here. And what these data show is that by overwhelming majorities across all generations, this group thinks that it's very important for people in the United States to learn English, especially in the first generation. We also asked the question, though, how important do you think it is that you and your family maintain the ability to speak Spanish? And notice that that's high as well. This is the insight. Additive American identity, not subtractive. The traditional immigrant narrative of the United States that you leave the home country behind. And that is a key, as Professor Huntington said, to moving forward in the United States is not the reality of this growing significant community in the United States, and maybe is more consistent with the lived reality rather than the scholarly and popular narrative of the immigrant experience in the United States, that in fact people have desires to maintain distinctiveness at the same time that they want to integrate into American society. We asked the question, how important is it for you to change to blend into the larger society, and how important is it to maintain your distinct culture? Again, what you see here is simultaneity, duality, multiplicity. It's an additive, inclusive understanding of what it means to be in this country. You want to do both. It's not either or. It's both and. Very quickly, sense of American and home country identification across generations. How strongly do you think of yourself as an American? Not surprisingly, by increasing generation, you identify strongly. But already in the first generation, 1/4 identify very strongly, and 28% somewhat strongly with being American. This is consistent, but you also identify strongly with your home country. Two last comments, and then I'll stop. And if you believe that may not be accurate. Just joking with you. We asked questions about multiple identity. And we asked, how strongly do you identify as an American? How strongly do you identify with your national origin group? And how strongly do you identify as a pan-ethnic, a Latino or Hispanic? What we found is that people identify very strongly with all three, simultaneously. It's additive, not subtractive. Now, if you push people and say, with which one do you identify more strongly, they will tell you, but overwhelmingly, by national origin group, people identify simultaneously with all three. The opportunity to build that multicultural, inclusive society by saying you don't choose one over the other. You choose both and. And that's the lived experience of this community in the United States. Immigrants have a place in that dream, as demonstrated by there, and according to our respondents, they wanted to share that dream with others. By that, I mean we asked questions about financial aid for undocumented students, and they said it was very important to share that. Now, finally, and this is my last slide, what does this all suggest? It all suggests to me that if we're to focus on civic education and developing a new civic identity, we have to understand that these growing demographics and these evolving demographics are very clear in showing how much these lines are coming together and how much each of our communities is dependent on the other's success for their own success. Perhaps part of a reconceptualization of civic identity in the United States needs to be grounded in terms like linked fate and common destiny. We need to help, I think, our youth and work and establish mechanisms of education that help our youth better see themselves and their future, consistent with elements of the report about common good and understanding the good, to see themselves as having a capacity, as was said before, to build a unique society of linked fate and common destiny. To conclude, that's what those folks were doing in Los Angeles in 2006. They were asking to be part of the larger society. And they were demonstrating their faith in the institutions of governance, despite their lived experiences, that in participating, they might in fact be able to realize that Americano dream. Wouldn't it be wonderful if more of our political leaders and more of our educational leaders and all of us involved in education began to use more of this language in our work and teaching as well? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. And our last presenter for the day is Dr. Kenneth Zeichner, the Boeing Professor of Teacher Education at the University of Washington.
Good morning. I want to say a little bit about my background and the fact that civics education is not my field, but I think I have some things to offer that I think affect the ability to achieve the goals that are set forth in the report related to civic education. I was a public school teacher. I was a social studies teacher, but I was also a math teacher and a science teacher and a teacher of many other things, as having taught upper elementary grades. For about the last 37 years, I've been preparing teachers and administering programs that prepare teachers, both at the University of Wisconsin and here. And I'm also engaged in a public debate at the national level about public schooling and whether it should continue to exist, and about issues of what's called the teacher quality debate over the quality of teachers in the U.S. teaching force. Eliminating the democracy divide is what I'm going to focus on. The term democracy divide was coined by a friend of mine and long-term colleague at the University of Wisconsin, Diana Hess, who was a member of this panel that produced the report. Last weekend I had an experience that sort of underlined for me this issue of democracy divide. I was in Madison a week ago. Last Sunday morning I boarded a plane to head back to Seattle. And when I was walking on the plane, I saw all these teenagers around me with these jackets on that said the Menlo School. And I couldn't, why are these kids from this prep, it was obviously some kind of prep school, in Madison, Wisconsin, boarding this plane at 7 in the morning on a Sunday. I later found out that the National Mock Trial Championship was in Madison, Wisconsin last week. It was won by Seattle Prep, I later found out. And so I'm sitting on the plane surrounded by all these kids in these jackets, Menlo School, reading a book called Hope Against Hope about schooling in post-Katrina New Orleans, and particularly reading about one of the schools featured in the book, Kipp High School, where kids are regimented in ways that make me very uncomfortable when I read about it, in terms of walking down these lines in the hallways, not allowing them to turn their heads, having to snap their fingers in particular instances, and there's punishment for violating the rules and embarrassment of the kids. It's the kind of school, and we're producing these kinds of schools across the United States now for other people's children. I doubt there will be many people here that would want their own children or grandchildren attending these schools, where this strict discipline in a Foucaultian sense is enacted. I think we're allowing some things to happen in a broader way that I think are interfering with our ability to achieve these noble goals about civic development, civic engagement in the public schools. So as it was pointed out earlier and in the report, historically, public schools in the United States, in these schools, civic education was part of the major mission of public schooling. And in this present context, even before No Child Left Behind, but especially during this era of No Child Left Behind, schools do not devote significant time and effort to civic education. And when it exists, it's often done poorly, as the report points out, defined in a very narrow way in terms of the accumulation of knowledge, not in the broad sense of knowledge, values, and skills that's elaborated on in the report. And the report also states that sectors of the population from low-income and marginalized communities have been most affected by the civic education gap, as they call it. And that's what the democracy divide is. And so we see things such as the narrowing of the curriculum in this current era of schooling in the United States, where what is not tested is reduced in emphasis. And in report after report, it's clear evidence that social studies and civic education have been marginalized the most when things get pushed out of the school. There was an article in the Seattle Times this week on recess, time for recess in elementary schools being reduced in Seattle, and especially in schools attended by children living in poverty. This same kind of phenomenon is happening at the national level, where the curriculum is being narrowed, and particularly in schools attended by children living in poverty, who are in many, many cases being taught by teachers who have been underprepared and who don't stay for a long time. These teach-for-a-while teachers that have flooded New Orleans and Philadelphia and Chicago and so on. So we're creating, in a sense, a two-tiered system of public education in the United States, where you can get a very good, rich, broad education in some public schools and in some of these private schools like the Menlo School and Seattle Prep and Lakeside Academy in the Seattle area. And when you actually separate those schools out in the, say, PISA rankings and the other measures of performance, the United States comes out very well. But we're increasingly providing an inferior education to a vast majority of children living across the United States. And so I want to talk a little bit about why I think this is happening and what we need to do about it. And I think if we can address these sort of broader problems, such as should we even have public schools in the United States, we will open the door for dealing with some of these problems for not only civic education and civic engagement, but a variety of other things, such as education in the arts and a variety of other things that are being pushed out of the public schools in this time. Rick Hess at the conference was talking about achievement gap mania. There was reference to STEM mania, and there are a lot of things being pushed out that I think have historically been part of the public schools and that parents want the schools to provide their children with. And one of the big things that I think is responsible for this is this current obsession with treating public education as a commodity rather than as a public good. The attention focused almost exclusively on this idea of getting something for the individual and very little discussion of what a strong public education system does for everyone and for the common good in this society. It's, public education, strong public education, is an important part of a democratic society, and we keep moving in this direction of everybody out for themselves to try to turn it into a marketplace, essentially. That is going to make it difficult, if not impossible, to address these problems of civic education. And along with this, turn education into a marketplace, and we've seen that particularly in cities like New Orleans, Philadelphia, where I'm from, Chicago, the large urban areas. We've narrowed the purposes of public education, which are many, to economic ones, preparing workers for the global economy, and that's been translated into an obsessive focus with raising standardized test scores in reading and mathematics, low-level standardized tests, rather than in providing a rich and broad education for everyone's children. And another element of this, so that it's not only the obsessive focus on standardized testing and pushing other things out of the curriculum, including civic education, but the punitive sanctions on teachers in schools who do not do well. And not surprisingly, most of the sanctions are on schools attended by other people's children. The ones being taught by teach-for-a-while teachers, and the ones where you're least likely to find if you find civic education at all, it's likely to be the rote kind, the narrow kind that's criticized in the report. Another element of this that keeps this process moving. It's like a train that's headed down the tracks, and we're not really addressing it, is the increased role of private. We referenced today about the growing inequality gap. A lot of that money that's been accumulated at the upper end is now being invested in education, both at the K-12 level and now at the teacher education level, developing alternatives to public education, to public teacher education, and the increased influence of those private interests on shaping public policy in education. The 3 top officials in the U.S. Education Department, none of them have a background in education. Just this week, or last week, the CEO of the New Schools Venture Fund, based in Oakland, California, that's responsible for a lot of the privatization of K-12 education, was named Undersecretary of Education. He's the official in the U.S. Department overseeing higher education in the United States. The second in command, James Shelton, came from the New Schools Venture Fund and the Gates Foundation. And we're seeing this growing presence of actually private interests shaping and writing public policy to promote a market agenda in public education. So, what we need to do about this? One, we need to find the space in the curriculum for civic education, and the civic education that's the good kind, the broad kind defined in the report that includes civic engagement. And in order to do that, we can't be satisfied and we can't tolerate measuring the success of teachers and schools only by answering the question, who can raise standardized test scores the most at a given moment in time? We need to ask other questions like, at what cost? Raising test scores at what cost? And we should hold the standard of the same rich and broad curriculum that we want for our own children, for everybody's children. And that's how we should measure the success of schools and teachers. And I think everybody who has children in the schools wants that rich, broad curriculum. They want their kids to have skills and to be able to do well on the test, but that's not enough. And the costs associated with it need to be taken into account. We need to start talking more about the common good in measuring success. Right after Katrina, there were over 7,000 teachers terminated wrongly, as the court later determined, in New Orleans, most of them African American. Just a few months ago, the court declared that the district needed to compensate them for being wrongly terminated. The social and economic costs of terminating over 7,000 teachers, most of them African American, need to be taken into account when we talk about the costs and benefits associated with different policies in education. And we can no longer tolerate this sort of lower standard and the second-class education in places that look like schools but really aren't, where you take everything out except focus on raising low-level standardized test scores. We can't tolerate that, and if we don't address it, and if we don't address the narrowing of the purposes of public education to economic ones, we're not going to make any progress on these more specific issues of civic education. A good teacher preparation is an important part of a high-quality civic education. There has been a narrowing of the curriculum in teacher education for elementary and secondary and middle school teachers with regard to social studies and civic education, as there has been at the K-12 level. And I just think about the College of Education here, of which I'm a member. We do not have a permanent faculty member since Alan Glenn retired in elementary social studies education. We do in secondary. And so that elementary social studies, which is sort of a marginal part of the program in relationship to the multiple math methods courses and literacy courses. So there's a correspondence between what's happened in K-12 education and teacher education. Good teacher preparation is important for civic education to be done well. And we need to start affirming once again the idea of teaching as a respected career. And we're allowing teaching as a career to disappear in terms of accepting for more and more children the idea that you can put somebody in a classroom who's had very little preparation, and who's going to leave very shortly afterwards. You're going to put them in there to teach other people's children. We don't want that for our own children, and I doubt that there are many advocates of these policies that have their own children in these schools. Wendy Kopp and her husband, her husband directs the KIPP schools. I don't think their kids attend KIPP schools. I don't know that they might attend more advantaged public schools, but I would guess they probably go to private schools. And so we need to start like other countries do in terms of the support for both public education in a broader way for everyone's children, and for teaching as a respected career that's valued and compensated well, and where the working conditions enable the teachers to do the work they need to do. And without addressing these sort of broader issues out here in the policy arena, the issues of civic education and civic engagement, we're not going to get very far. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken. And now we got time for some questions. I just did want to mention a couple themes that I heard that maybe we could start with. The first is the kind of discourse of American exceptionalism, sort of promise of America, this country, based on our history vis-a-vis civic engagement, volunteerism for the last 200 or 300 years, sort of in tension with social and economic inequality, which is, we've heard, is among the highest in the world. And even despite the blip that was the Fordist period post-war, looks like it's becoming worse by the day. And then finally, Dr. Zeitner was talking about the role of philanthropy in education, which I think is having a major impact on how we think about civic education and how it can play out in schools that are becoming increasingly standardized, and where the money is going to create certain kinds of schools they're tiered in different ways for different kinds of children. So those are just some things that I was thinking about as I was hearing these great panelists present today. And maybe we could speak to that and also have some questions come up. Does anybody want to say anything about that, or should we just take some questions? Okay, let's take questions from the audience. Yes.
I'll remember that. You'll need to use this one. I have a pretty loud voice. I'll remember that slide for a long time that Lee showed about the 2006 LA demonstration. It's a beautiful picture. What I wondered is, that, of course, was a protest against a legislation that horrified them. And what I'm wondering is, if you can imagine, this could be, Lance might answer this too, if you could imagine in our current climate, that kind of turnout for a proactive movement. Let's say like the union movement, for example, started. That wasn't really a protest. That was something that was built up politically by a lot of people back then that were concerned with oppressive conditions in the workplace and so on. And I can see with crash mobs, with all kinds of social media, you can pull people together when something horrible is happening. Is there a mechanism today that's viable for building a movement and getting people to stick with it long enough to actually create something new?
I take exception to characterizing it as a protest. I think it was a demonstration of faith in American political institutions. Those folks who were on that street, many were unauthorized and knew that they risked being separated from their children, knew that they risked being arrested by the police, knew that they risked being identified by their employer, for those who are unauthorized. And they did it anyway, and that all developed largely because of social media and Spanish language radio. Two elements that we don't always think of as mechanisms for promoting civic engagement. So first I'll say, I think it's useful to think of it as more than a protest because of the risks taken by many of the people there in making their positions known. And what they were asking for was not a protest against the legislation as much as it was a claim to legitimacy in American society. It was a claim for citizenship in a broader sense, not legal citizenship, but a claim for broader citizenship in the United States. An effort was made to try to sustain that movement and to try to use it as a way of registering voters and mobilizing, and it's had very, very uneven results. And among the major reasons that it has such uneven results is that it was impossible to find a funder to be able to strategically invest in those areas where that might be sustained. What I think the lesson is that we learn from that uneven, and that's part of what's being pursued by the remnant, the current version of the Obama for America campaign, which is now called the Campaign for America, is to in fact mobilize millions of dollars for targeted voter registration efforts in key parts of key states that has a focus on engaging youth and adults, particularly youth and adults both. The idea of parallel socialization that was mentioned earlier, that youth can often socialize their parents, is one that I think absolutely applies to many different communities, particularly to immigrant communities and communities with large numbers of youth, as a way of trying to see whether by investing in this way you can in fact begin to build an infrastructure that allows for sustained political engagement. Last comment, very quickly. The switch from California, from an historically Republican state, historically California has been Republican from the day that it was established as a state, happened in 1994 as a result of opposition to Proposition 187, an anti-government proposition, that had a counterintuitive consequence. It led to a strategic investment by labor unions, especially the SEIU, in civic engagement programs, voter registration, and candidate training sessions focused on Latino and other immigrant communities that switched California to now be one of the most democratic states in the country. Leaving aside the partisan consequences, magnificent example of strategic civic engagement that require the mobilization of resources at a variety of levels that could have the sort of consequences.
That's a really good question. I'd like to talk about what can we do around sustainable, large-scale pro-democracy organization. I think the beginning point for me is that the modern era is ending. And what does that mean? It means that the great public institutions that have provided our commonalities, our value systems, our gatekeepers, our authority systems are breaking down. There are multiple competing authorities in the world now. There are the school systems are fragmented, as you just pointed out. So that's just reality. The question is, what can we do beyond that in this transitional historical moment that Eric has pointed us to? And what I see are these large-scale uprisings, and the ones that I've been studying started with the financial meltdown in 2007, 8, 9, with the anthill in Iceland, which resulted in a popular assembly to advise the Icelandic government on rewriting its constitution, moving to Tahrir Square in the Arab Spring, overthrow of corrupt regimes in those countries, moving to Spain with the Indignados, whose challenge was real democracy now, filling the streets. And these were not flash-in-the-pan protests. I was in Barcelona several times during a very long period of the Indignados uprising, and I witnessed marches in the streets in which young people, and these are very engaged young people, the unemployment rate in Spain was 40%, not for youth under 25, and so they were motivated. But what was interesting to me was that it was a festival atmosphere. It was a civic education project. People were reading things and sending each other online things to look at. The parents and grandparents of these young people filled the sidewalks as the marches went down the main streets, cheering them on. Something like 25% of the Spanish population that they were part of this experience. It was all generational, all ages kind of movement. And then we get to Occupy Wall Street, which not only challenged the sovereignty of American democracy, but pointed out the problems of inequality that we've been talking about this morning. So these things, it may seem like flash in the pans, but they are existing, I think, much in the spirit of Louise's remarks. They focus attention. They then lead to people behaving in other ways, doing very strategic things. So I see this as the new kind of protest and the new kind of mobilization. Large-scale socially mediated networks that are raising serious questions around the world about the legitimacy of democratic systems today. And that's now a question. That's a question a lot of people are talking about, and the question is how can we reclaim our democracy? And that's a big civic education project, and it's in the streets. So I'm thinking pretty optimistically about these things.
Hi, my name is Christina Sellesley, and I'm representing Seattle City Club, a local civics organization. And so I'm Christina Sellesley from Seattle City Club, and we've recently started a youth civic education program. And the emphasis is to bring youth into civics, meaning civic action. So what is the best way to bring them into that, not dusty textbooks like we've referenced in the past. So my question is, what are the institutions that are actually working and effective in teaching, in inspiring civics in young people? We've looked at schools, we've talked about how schools don't have time to deal with that anymore. So is it after school programming, after school programming? Is it up to the parents? Where should those pressure points be applied?
Hi, I'd like to speak to that. I think it's really vital that we also remember that there is actually some really great work going on. So I'll speak to this in relation to the study that we just completed data collection for. We went through a very rigorous process of over 8 months, handpicking exceptional teachers of civics in immigrant settings. And some of what they were doing was extraordinary and really great. And so I think it's really important, even as I stand here before you, urging us to think about complex context. I want to send a shout out to the teachers here who are doing important, complex, innovative work in their settings, but all too often is not supported. So I just really want to put that out on the table because we know, given the context of the setup, that Ken Zeichner laid out how challenging this work is. And so we really do need to honor our teachers that are doing this very complex work. I mean, the cognitive, emotional complexity of keeping your tabs on the different students in your classroom and the subject matter and all of the dynamics that are happening. But these are very complex skill sets that our teachers are offering. So that's one contribution that I would like to make. The other thing that I would like to say here is there's something in the report about really having youth, especially when we start talking about power issues, how there's so much potential to really have youth thinking more explicitly about the people they care about and the issues that they care about. And so one suggestion I would offer is really going close. So, for example, one student in our study, who we call Rudy, often was at a loss for what to say when the teacher would ask her about particular subjects. But then when she had to write a letter to President Obama and was searching for an issue, and the issue of unemployment came up, she had quite a lot to say about witnessing her mother's struggles. There was something about being able to speak to this immigrant youth from Ethiopia originally. There was something really powerful about speaking on her mother's behalf and writing to President Obama. So those are two comments that I have.
need their own advocates, especially in the state capital. What I learned from those two is you have to take it out of time. You have to get them engaged and actually begin to understand their capacity to influence others. Very, very quick story. The recent passage of the Real Hope Act in the state legislature that provides need-based financial aid, the state need grant here in Washington to unauthorized students. The key to that switch occurring was a meeting of 3 young, undocumented female students with the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee, where in that meeting she cried, that is the chair cried, in hearing the stories of these young women and their educational achievements and their life story. And that member of the chair of the Senate Higher Education Committee, who had prevented a vote from occurring the year before, when they knew there was bipartisan support to get it to the committee for political reasons we didn't want to vote, shared the story in tears of her picking cotton as a white, a young woman, picking cotton in Alabama as a youth to be able to supplement her family income. Those are the types of lessons of power that the youth had in just telling their story to influence the key decision maker. More of those opportunities, I think, might be other ways to think of trying to engage large numbers of people.
So that's influence here. You know about keeping sound off and the Y team there, because you're on board of that. But here's what we've learned, I think, indeed going even back before Colleen joined the keeping sound off team. There are dozens of civic organizations doing really incredibly interesting youth work. And One America is a great organization. They were one of our founding partners in keeping sound off and funding partners, I should add. And what we've learned, though, is that a lot of these organizations are competing against each other because of funding, basically. So rather than pool their resources and their young people into broader projects, they are competing. So I guess if I step it up a level and say that they're out there, and Puget Sound Office work with almost every youth organization in the Seattle region. But that this has been my big takeaway, and that if funders would more or less leverage their power to get these organizations to form coalitions and pool their resources and do common projects, that would be a huge step up. And then the other step up would be if we could actually get real about the service learning. I mean, service learning is a joke. So and not always, not 100% of the cases, but it's just something that kids are doing because they have to do it and get it on their resumes. If we could actually somehow get a service learning program with some real civic teeth in it, that would produce the kids. I mean, that's where the kids are, but they now are not being compelled to do kind of politically oriented service learning programs in large numbers. They're very individualized and they're scattered all over the place. So those would be my two takeaways. If City Club could think about service learning and partner with the schools and sort of get some policy directives going around service learning, that would make a difference for democratic engagement, community political engagement, and advocacy. That would be a terrific transformation in the Seattle youth.
Somebody here.
Thank you. Do you want me to go? Okay, please.
Thanks very much for this very valuable session today. And I'd like to add a story about One America, actually. I'm Michelle Anciologi. I'm the World Languages and International Education Program Supervisor at the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. I work closely with Carol Coase from the University of Washington and Social Studies Program Supervisor. So I assure you on the 5th floor at Boys Academy, we talk about civic engagement all of the time. So in addition to that very important act that passed this year, there was another very important piece of legislation, the Seal of Life Literacy. And I can say quite honestly that the only reason it passed was because of the students from One America who came and spoke to the Economic and Achievement Gap Committee, as well as in the Senate in particular, and gave testimony and showed the certificates they were getting from competency-based credits they were getting for a variety of languages. And what
it meant to them to have their home language recognized. And we've done over, last year alone, we did over 1,600 students earn credits in over 40 languages, and we'll be at least twice that this year. So I did bring a handout about the seal of biliteracy, but I just wanted to commend that it got results in addition to giving an opportunity to participate, see their voice out, and something was very personal. It's critical, and so I agree totally about doing that. And one of the things I feel, because we don't seem to have anybody else from the state represented here today, is that it's when we talk about standardized tests and the way things have been, the narrowing of curriculum, I think it's really important to keep an eye on where we're heading with the Common Core state standards and smarter balance. It's not like a perfect system, but the conversations in education now, as compared to the last several years, are very, very different. For one thing, the balance of what it means to be literate and to meet those standards requires working closely with social studies. That becomes a major feature of what needs to be done, because that's where nonfiction text is typically done. And that's where students learn to persuade and compare and contrast and show cause and effect and the kinds of things that they may not get in their English language classes. So it's where we're heading. Let's not dwell too much on No Child Left Behind in the past, even though we lost our waiver. But let's make sure that this new system, and it happens in our state as the lead state on smarter balance, that it actually does provide a great library of resources on formative assessment and provides the multiple sources for providing input to students, and that we realize that it's through real life experiences engagement in civic education that is where students will gain those literacy skills as well. Thank you.
So it's 12. Should we go on a little bit? Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Pamela Joseph, University of Washington campus. I'd like to return to the idea about civic education in schools. There's so much we're hearing this morning about how overwhelming there are against, I'm not talking rote drill civic education, but authentic experiences for students. And going back to the idea of living in an oligarchy, in this circumstance, not a republic and not a democracy, civic education is very dangerous. And even President Obama, who supposedly is a progressive president, just nearly fell off the chair in his second inaugural address when he said, education is for training workers, and he stopped. The discourse is so powerful, and it's being accepted, and it's not being questioned by a lot of people at least. And I think that in order, and this is where I would like the ideas of the first panel and the second, how is it that civics education as a movement can succeed unless it becomes a political movement? Why are we not identifying candidates? Why are we not challenging the idea of our students being educated only to be workers or even high-level workers? So I find it very alarming, and yet I know it's very hard in the higher education to say, well, we really need to join with others and make these changes. We need these changes working with teachers, working with community members, politicians. It's got to be much more than just an educational movement, I think. I'd like to hear anyone else's thoughts on this.
What that reminded me of is that there's a lot of activity around the country right now. People out in the streets protesting, their schools being quote-unquote turned around, teachers being fired and replaced with young people from outside the community who have no ties or commitment to the community. And so there are actually a lot of kids, high school kids, who are engaged in those protests trying to save their neighborhood schools. And so when I think about preparing teachers to go out into the public schools, one of the first things that I want them to recognize is that engagement is already going on, that there are kids involved in it, and they as teachers need to become part of it rather than go in and I'm going to come in and save you poor people, which is oftentimes the position that outsiders coming into communities take. So I think there's a lot of positive things going on now as
years ago to write a high school American government textbook and work with a major publisher. And the theme that I gave to the book was the responsibilities of leadership. And I made the argument, and the idea behind the book was, yes, you can use 3 branches of government, how a bill becomes law, all of that sort of thing. Is there a way to give it a twist that allows the student and the teacher to both feel simultaneously empowered? And I used the idea of the responsibilities of leadership and made the following argument. What its impact has been is varied. I haven't gotten any wonderful letters from students that say, thank you for writing that. Yes, I got. But the idea behind it is to say, when American government has been at its best, and its leaders have been at their best, they have exercised responsibilities of leadership, coming up with creative ideas, making hard choices, and honestly and transparently assessing the consequences of those choices and learning from them. And I was using it as a way to try to say there's a way of understanding our institutions of governance in the same way that you might understand yourself. And when you're responsible in making decisions about yourself and your life. It's a very interesting process to learn about how you write such a book. One, we don't know how to do that as scholars at universities. You can write at a different level with the people who prepare you and help you do that. Two, all of these state-based regulations that each book has to, that each fact has to be validated by, and that has to include certain information. It's a really complicated process to try to have an influence in how government is thought about at the secondary level. But really, for political science, it's very interesting to try to figure out what the consequences of the requirements being included and so forth. I wonder whether we need to target particular school districts that may have a cultural politics, so to speak, for education that will allow for this sort of much more creative engagement as part of the curriculum learning of other kinds, and not think about the larger urban school districts that are complicated, and see whether or not you're looking at smaller districts that may have a culture that would be open to this, to service models on which to learn, to then try to leverage policies that allow for more creativity on the part of schools and teachers especially who are engaged in that work.
Oh, please.
Hello, my name is Damon. I'm an associate here at Endowed, and I wanted to talk about the idea of this additive identity, which I loved, but I do think that the reality, keeping it real, is that for a lot of people, the act of saying I'm American is not enough when coming from certain faces or accents. And as you said, people are pushed to choose which one they identify with more. And on the flip side, there are also a lot of people for whom the multiplicity of their identities are not as salient as being from 2 countries, from being from immigrant families, things like that. So my question is, at a certain point, is it necessary or useful to define a uniquely American identity? And if so, does that by nature necessarily mean being exclusionary?
The history of the United States, most of its history, the American identity has been exclusionary. Ironically, very good book on this, might be a very good book, by Roger Smith, of the Times New called Civic Ideas, where he argues that America is, that the American creed is based on 3 multiple traditions. He calls them civic tenets. One is individualism. The second is the sense of communitarianism and working with the group. And the third is the phrase that only a social scientist can love, right? Ascriptive inegalitarianism, which is the idea that you can become part of the larger community only if you maintain exclusion. That is, we'll let our boundary lines grow and allow you to become part of the mainstream or part of the traditional understanding of the but never for everybody. And that is a consequence of the way in which we as a nation have evolved to allow ourselves to become more inclusive and democratic. You see the irony there, right? That exclusion is essential to inclusion. And you have to say that may have worked historically, but the changing demographics, I think, require a different sort of vision and a new challenge to that concept. The data that I was presenting are not how other people perceive this group, but how we perceive itself. And the logic behind it is that if we can help people understand that when someone looks different, or speaks a language whether it speaks English with an accent, or appears to be dressed in a different way, or is covered in a particular way, that doesn't mean that that individual wants to just be separate. It means they want to identify uniquely. That doesn't mean they don't want to identify as American, or be committed to civic ideals, or want to vote, participate, run for office, or any of the other things. That's the challenge, is getting us as a society to accept that additive possibility, and then to embrace it as America at its best, rather than America at its worst, in the fashion of that descriptive ideology.
I agree with Luis that the way in which this country has dealt with this question in the past won't work in the future. It won't work for various reasons. The breakdown of modern institutional order that I talked about a minute ago. And so what we have is a political negotiation, a very nasty and brutish political negotiation, which, for example, our president's real American credentials were challenged, and have continuously been challenged since before his election and through his second election. So is Barack Obama a real American became a real question. I mean, sad here that may be. And that's going on in Sweden, it's going on in France, and it's always been in the background, but now it's in the foreground. That's the difference. It's in the foreground of public debates in many countries that have allowed their public institutions and their gatekeeping mechanisms and their authority systems to be broken down by neoliberal market policies. Essentially, in schools, in child and labor forces, and immigration laws, and other areas. So now, to the point of what can we begin to do about this, it seems to me that civic education obviously plays a part, but it's not the civic education of the dutiful citizen era in which tolerance was the code word for all of this. We're in post-tolerance societies. So if tolerance isn't the civic buzzword in the educational tool that it once was, it seems to me that one solution, and this is only a modest one of many that we, as Eric said, are challenged by and need to respond to those challenges creatively. But one is to provide voice and organizational capacities to people so they can better negotiate their civic status. And that could become part of civic education. That's why we took those issues of organization and advocacy outside of the classroom, because they weren't really welcome there, and put them into the community and help community organizations through Sound Off and other venues begin to help young people learn to organize on their own behalf and better represent themselves in the unfortunate discussions about who's a real American today.
So it's 12:15. Unless there are any more pressing questions, I think we should move to the conference session adjournment. And Jim, are you going to lead us away? Thank you.
Yeah. Let's thank this panel, including Professor Catherine Mitchell, for this, as we say it in the old African American Baptist Church, it's been good, hasn't it? And it's my spirits have been lifted to continue with the kind of biblical analogy that Eric started with. And I think all things have a beginning and an ending, and I think that we are really at the ending. I had saved this time for Bill had to leave early, but if Eric or any panel members, I had just saved this time for any final comments. And where do we go from here? And I think I've just been enormously impressed with my colleagues here at Washington. I mean, we searched the world and we found the best people. I learned so much from all of you, and I've been enriched. Is there any panel member or Susan or anybody who would like to make, or Cherry Banks, by the way, I think, who's attended, I want to acknowledge her presence. I think she's attended every symposium that the center has given for the last 20 years. Let's give her a hand for her commitment. Susan, Eric, or any panel member want to make any comments? Eric, did you want to say something? That's what I saved these 15 minutes for.
I don't have much to say, except in the first place, really wanted to thank this panel. This was, I just filled a couple of pages just scribbling as all of you were speaking. And, among the things that I feel like are really worth calling out as sort of takeaway themes for all of us, there are a couple of things in particular. Lance's emphasis on this crisis of legitimacy, I guess the way you put it, is profoundly important. Like, again, back to that theme of may we live in interesting times, as old forms of legitimacy begin to collapse, there will be new forms that arise. That's a given. The only question is who shall shape them, right? And I think I'm infused with a lot of sense of purpose just in hearing this, even though it's framed in terms of crisis. That's our job. Our job is to really begin to articulate the terms on which new forms of legitimacy are going to be created, and that's where stuff that Luis was saying about additive American identity, this idea that it's simultaneity and multiplicity, and to put it in more scientific terms, it's non-zero, right? It is not zero-sum, where adding language about ethnic identity somehow subtracts from American identity. It's 1 + 1 = 3, non-zero outcomes, right? And the thing about this language of non-zero is that in all arenas, whether you're talking about in a strictly, in a petri dish, literally, a scientific experiment, or in the petri dish we call the United States, right? This kind of grand experiment of throwing people together from around the world. Experiments that work and groups that are successful are those that figure out over and over and over again how to get non-zero outcomes, how to make 1 + 1 = 3. And I think this task of really trying to figure out how to fuse this language that embraces real diversity and real multiplicity of identities, and fusing that with our reimagined notion of Americanness, is our job. And I'm super excited about that, just hearing this panel and hearing us talk about the ways to do that in school and out of school, and in institutions that prepare people for in school and out of school. So I just want to say thank you for that conversation.
Thank you, Jim. Eric. And I have one final announcement. The report is now launched. Please, it'll be available in two forms: the hard copy, which we sell for just cause. It's in your flyer what we sell it for. I hope you'll encourage people to order the hard copy. The electronic copy will be available free on our website now that it's been launched. But we ask you to download only one for your personal use, and if you want more copies, buy the hard copy. Thank you so much for coming, and have the rest of a good weekend. Thank you.